Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves standing before a grand imposing stone structure in the quiet French countryside. Picture it, thick ancient walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain, stretching towards a slate gray sky. You can almost smell the damp earth, the faint scent of wood smoke from some unseen chimney, and the deep cool aroma of old stone itself. It's a place steeped in time, a monastery that has stood silent witness to eras, long past a beacon of quiet contemplation, far from the madding crowd. Tonight we're going to pull back the veil on this seemingly tranquil scene and discover something hidden beneath its peaceful surface. A secret, or at least something secreted away. Be warned, the revelations might be so profoundly understated. You might just drift off before the truly explosive non-climax hits. You probably won't survive this level of historical inaction. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always cool to see how far these quiet little histories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there, feet planted on the slightly uneven ground of what was once maybe a pilgrim's path, looking up at this monastery. It feels incredibly solid, incredibly permanent. Not like the flimsy, flat-pack furniture world you inhabit today. No, this thing was built to last, stone upon careful stone, crafted by hands that knew calluses and felt the bite of the wind. You can imagine the monks' habits rustling, going about their day centuries ago. They weren't exactly rock stars of their time, you know. More like the quiet tech support guys of the medieval world. Keeping the books, preserving knowledge, praying. A historian might tell you that medieval monasteries played a crucial role in the cultural and economic landscape of Europe, acting as centers of learning, hospitality, and agricultural innovation. They were in many ways islands of relative stability in a sometimes chaotic world. But this particular monastery nestled away here wasn't one of the big famous ones. It didn't host kings or house jaw-dropping relics that drew pilgrims from across the known world, though most monasteries claimed something noteworthy, even if it was just a splinter from Noah's Ark or the toe bone of a moderately obscure saint. No, this place was quieter, more humble. The kind of place where the biggest drama was probably Brother Thomas burning the communion wafers, or Brother Antoine misplacing the key to the wine cellar for an entire afternoon. Thrilling stuff, right? As you approach, you notice the details. The way the rain has worn channels into the stone gargoyles perched high on the eaves, spitting water away from the walls. The intricate yet slightly naive carvings around the main entrance, depicting scenes you might need a medieval history degree to fully decipher, or maybe just a good imagination. It's easy to get lost in the sheer weight of history pressing down. You can almost hear the faint echo of Gregorian chant, a low resonant sound that would have filled these spaces for centuries, a rhythmic pulse against the silence of rural life. This wasn't a place of bustling activity, it was a place of routine, of contemplation, of the slow turning of the year marked by feast days and fasting. The monks lived simple lives focused on prayer, labor, and study. They woke before dawn, prayed multiple times a day, worked in the fields, or the scriptorium, ate simple meals, and went to bed early. Their world was small, bounded by the monastery walls and the nearby village, if one even existed. It wasn't the setting for daring escapes or cloak and dagger meetings, or so it seemed. And yet beneath this veneer of quiet spiritual predictability lay something else, something unexpected. Like finding a secret trapdoor under the rug in your grandma's incredibly beige living room. It just doesn't fit the vibe. For centuries, the monastery kept its secrets, if it even knew it had them. Generations of monks prayed, died, and were buried on its grounds. Perhaps walking right over? Well, we'll get to that. The history books for this specific order, assuming you could even find them in some dusty archive, would likely talk about abbots building projects, land disputes with local lords, maybe a particularly harsh winter that damaged the roof. Standard monastic chronicles. Nothing whispers of hidden passages of tunnels dug deep into the earth. The known history is one of steadfast piety, of quiet devotion, of existing on the periphery of the grand narratives of kings and wars. Historians still argue whether the founding date they have on record for this particular monastery is accurate, or if it actually began as a smaller hermitage centuries before the first stone of the current structure was laid. Even the origins are slightly fuzzy, lost to time, and questionable record-keeping by candlelight. It's this very uneventfulness that makes the discovery of the passages so intriguing in its own low-key way. It's the historical equivalent of finding out your incredibly quiet, unassuming neighbor has a basement full of something completely bizarre. You'd expect secret tunnels under a castle, right? Or a king's palace. Places of power, intrigue, potential sieges. But a humble monastery dedicated to prayer and agricultural self-sufficiency? What possible need could they have had for a network of subterranean passages? Were they smuggling wine? Hiding from tax collectors? Holding clandestine meetings with? Who? The local farmers. Did they have a secret bowling alley down there? Unlikely, but you have to consider all options when the standard narrative breaks down. The silence of the monastery's history is broken only by the eventual accidental uncovering of these hidden ways. It's like the building itself held its breath for centuries and only recently exhaled, revealing a breath of musty, cool air from below. You feel a strange sense of anticipation mixed with the pervading calm of the place. What could be down there? What story do these silent stones and the earth beneath them have to tell? It's a question that hangs in the air, thick with the smell of old stone and damp earth, pulling you closer to the mystery, lurking just out of sight, waiting patiently underfoot. You're standing there, the question hanging in the cool air, thick with the smell of old stone and damp earth, pulling you closer to the mystery, lurking just out of sight, waiting patiently underfoot. And that waiting, it went on for centuries. People walked over it, prayed near it, lived their lives within the shadow of these walls, entirely unaware of the silence beneath. The passages weren't found during some dramatic treasure hunt dreamt up by a pulp novelist. They weren't stumbled upon by a daring spy or a fleeing rogue monk. No, their discovery was predictably, for this setting, far more mundane. It happened during a routine repair sometime in the late 20th century. The monastery, no longer inhabited by a full complement of monks, but perhaps used for retreats or housing a small custodial order, needed some work done. Let's imagine it was a particularly persistent damp problem affecting a section of the foundation near the old kitchen, or maybe the sacristy. You know the drill. Peel back the plaster, chip away at some crumbling mortar, maybe dig a little to reinforce something. The kind of grunt work that makes you appreciate modern construction despite its lack of timeless charm. So picture it, a couple of workmen, maybe a bit bored, certainly not expecting anything exciting. They're down there chipping away, dust flying, probably complaining about the pay or what's for lunch. One swing of a pickaxe, instead of hitting solid rock or packed earth, goes through. There's a hollow sound distinct from the solid thud they'd been hearing. A sound that makes you pause, wipe the sweat from your brow and look closer. Curiosity, the quiet engine of many discoveries, kicks in. They chip away more carefully, now the hole widening, revealing not just an empty cavity, but a shape, a built shape. An archway, roughly cut but definitely intentional, leading into absolute darkness. It wasn't dramatic, no trumpets sounded, no ancient curses were unleashed. Just the scrape of a tool, a hollow sound, and a quiet, "Huh, what's that?" It's the historical equivalent of finding a secret passage behind a bookshelf. Only the bookshelf is made of several tons of ancient stone, and the passage is full of spiders. Charming. The immediate reaction was likely confusion. Why would this humble monastery have this? You might expect cellars for storage, maybe a cistern, certainly drainage systems, hence the initial damp problem, but a distinct man-made opening leading into the darkness. It didn't fit the blueprint, historical or assumed. News probably filtered up slowly. The foreman was called, then maybe the head of the small religious community, still on site, then perhaps local historical experts. The initial excitement was probably palpable if contained within the generally reserved atmosphere of the place. Treasure. An escape route from invaders, a secret meeting place for some forgotten illicit purpose. The mind race is fueled by too many adventure novels. They're peering into the gloom, shining inadequate flashlights into the inky blackness. The air that wafts out is cool, damp, and smells profoundly of earth and time, like the breath of something that has been sleeping for centuries. It's not a fresh, airy space. It feels enclosed, ancient, and utterly silent, absorbing the light from their torches. Getting down there wasn't exactly easy. It wasn't a grand staircase. Maybe a narrow, uneven opening, requiring them to squeeze through, lowering themselves carefully into the void. The first steps inside would have been cautious, maybe hitting uneven ground or stepping into shallow puddles. The beams from their lights cut through the thick dust motes, dancing in the air, revealing rough-hewn walls, not finely dressed stone, but rock carved directly out of the earth. It's clear this wasn't part of the main building's architecture. It was dug beneath, it a separate entity entirely. Mainstream historical fact tells us that monasteries often had extensive underground infrastructure. Not just cellars, but also crypts, sometimes sophisticated water management systems, and even underground tunnels for specific purposes like moving goods or waste discreetly. However, these were usually well documented or logically connected to the monastery's function. What they were seeing here didn't seem to connect to anything obvious. It just was. As they ventured further, the passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrow, sometimes opening slightly, but always maintaining that sense of being carved out of the living rock. There were no signs of habitation, no discarded tools, no ancient pottery shards scattered on the floor. Nothing to give a clue as to who dug this or when. Just the bare earth, the silence, and the cool, still air. They might have found a quirky tidbit, perhaps a single rusted nail embedded deep in the wall, or an oddly shaped stone that looked like it was carved into a rudimentary face before being discarded. Something small and out of place that only deepened the mystery. No treasure chests, no hidden chambers filled with forbidden scrolls. The passages kept going for a short distance, perhaps a few dozen meters before reaching a dead end. Just a wall of solid rock. No door, no hidden lever, no secret room beyond. It just stopped. And trying another branch, if there was one, led to a similar frustrating conclusion. Every path seemed to terminate abruptly, leading nowhere. This is where the real puzzle began. If these passages led nowhere, what were they for? Were they unfinished, abandoned partway through? Or did they serve some purpose that didn't involve reaching a specific destination? Historians still argue whether these passages were intended for spiritual discipline, perhaps a kind of underground cloister for solitary meditation or penance, or if they were part of an unfinished escape plan, or maybe even just an exploratory excavation that was quickly abandoned when it hit impenetrable rock or proved too difficult. The lack of any artifacts or clear structural purpose makes interpretation incredibly difficult. It's like finding half a sentence written on a piece of paper and trying to reconstruct the entire novel. The initial excitement of discovery quickly morphed into a profound historical shrug. Oh, tunnels. That go there and stop. Xian. Not exactly Indiana Jones territory, is it more like finding a secret drawer in your desk that just contains old paper clips? Hugely exciting for a moment, then slightly anticlimactic. So there you are, squinting into the feeble beam of a flashlight, the initial rush of discovery already fading into that familiar historical feeling of, wait, what? You found something old, something hidden, something clearly requiring significant effort to create, but it stops, abruptly. Dead ends everywhere. It's like opening a beautifully wrapped present only to find an empty box inside. You poke around, run your hand over the rough-hewn rock, maybe kick a loose stone. Carefully, you don't want to bring the whole place down, and the silence presses in heavier now that the excitement has subsided. What was this? The questions started immediately buzzing around the heads of those first explorers like disturbed bats. Their minds, like yours, would have jumped to the most dramatic possibilities first. Secret escape route. Naturally. Hidden treasure vault. Obvious candidate, never mind the complete lack of vaults or treasure. A place for forbidden rituals. History loves a good conspiracy, doesn't it? But as the initial Indiana Jones fantasies evaporated in the damp, still air, more practical, or at least more plausible theories began to emerge. These passages had to serve some purpose. People, particularly in monastic settings, didn't just dig holes in the ground for fun. Well, mostly. Though monastic discipline could get pretty creative, but we'll get to that. One of the leading early hypotheses, and one that often springs to mind first, was that these were escape tunnels. Monasteries, you see, weren't always the tranquil havens of quiet contemplation you might imagine. Throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, they were often wealthy institutions, owning vast tracts of land, accumulating riches in the form of precious relics, illuminated manuscripts, and valuable objects. This made them attractive targets. Mainstream historical fact. Monasteries were frequently fortified or had defensive features, and their wealth meant they could be vulnerable to attack, whether from Viking raiders in earlier centuries, marauding bandits, rival lords during times of conflict, or even disgruntled peasants. So an escape route makes a certain kind of sense, doesn't it? A way for the monks, or perhaps the abbot, in the most valuable possessions to slip away unseen if the monastery walls were breached. You can picture it, right? The alarm bells ringing, the sound of battering rams on the gate, and a desperate scramble down into the dark, hoping to emerge somewhere safe. Perhaps outside the main compound, maybe even in a nearby forest or village. It's a compelling image straight out of historical drama. However, the reality of the passages quickly throws cold water on this particular theory. For an escape route to be effective, it needs to well escape. It needs to go somewhere. And these passages, as we've established, went resolutely nowhere. They stopped, dead, against solid rock. An escape route that ends in a wall isn't terribly useful, unless the plan was to simply buy a few minutes before being trapped underground. Not exactly a solid survival strategy. So while the idea of an escape route fits the historical context of potential threats to a monastery, the physical reality of these particular tunnels makes it highly improbable they ever served that function, or at least not a successful one. They weren't camouflaged exits emerging discreetly into the landscape. They were just tunnels terminating blindly. Unless the enemy was particularly dim-witted and gave up searching, if they didn't find anyone above ground, this theory doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's the historical equivalent of installing a fire escape that leads only to a locked shed. Better than nothing, maybe. Probably not. Okay, so if not escape, what about something more practical? Storage, perhaps. Monasteries required vast storage space. They were often self-sufficient communities cultivating land-brewing beer, making wine, storing grain, wool, cheese, and all manner of supplies. Cellars and crypts were common features. Could these passages have been intended for storing something? But again, look around. The passages are narrow in places, uneven and difficult to navigate. Not ideal for rolling barrels, stacking sacks of grain, or moving anything bulky. And those pesky dead ends. How do you organize storage in a series of short, disconnected cul-de-sacs? It doesn't seem efficient or logical for any kind of bulk storage or movement of goods. Imagine trying to retrieve a barrel of wine from the end of a tunnel that only has one way in and out. You'd need a medieval forklift that could turn on a dime. Not likely. So the storage theory, while plausible in the abstract for a monastery, doesn't fit the specific characteristics of these passages. What about something less tangible, something related to the spiritual life of the monks? Monasticism was about discipline, contemplation, and sometimes rigorous physical penance. Could these passages have served a religious purpose? Perhaps as a place for solitary prayer, extreme meditation, or a symbolic journey into darkness and isolation as a form of spiritual discipline? Entering the earth, cutting oneself off from the light in the community could be seen as a metaphor for death, burial, or the descent into the self. There are historical accounts of hermits living in caves or subterranean cells. Could this be a more communal or at least sanctioned version of that? The darkness, the silence, the confined space? You can see how it might lend itself to intense introspection. However, if this were the case, you might expect some small signs of use. Perhaps a smoothed stone where someone knelt, a niche for a lamp, or a small icon, maybe even a simple carving or inscription. The passages are utterly bare. They feel less like intentional spiritual cells and more like holes, plain, undecorated holes. So while the idea of a spiritual purpose is perhaps more emotionally resonant than storage, the complete lack of any supporting evidence makes it hard to argue convincingly. It feels like trying to prove someone used their basement for deep meditation when all you find are some dusty boxes and a broken washing machine. Possible, but not the most likely explanation. Then there's the most anticlimactic theory of all. Maybe they just stopped digging. Maybe it was an unfinished project. This theory fits the dead ends perfectly. They started digging for some reason. Perhaps they did intend an escape route, or a new cellar system, or even were trying to locate a specific geological feature or resource underground. Quirky tidbit. Some historical sources mention monastic communities engaging in what might seem like peculiar digging activities, sometimes linked to searching for specific types of clay, for pottery pigments, for manuscripts, or even following local folklore about subterranean springs or hidden natural caves used by earlier inhabitants. So maybe they were looking for something specific. They started digging, hit an unexpectedly hard layer of rock, encountered unforeseen structural problems. With the ground above ran out of money, the key person in charge of the project died, or simply decided it was too much effort for too little reward. They just stopped. Abandoned the project partway through. This happens all the time in construction, even today. Imagine trying to build a subway system with only shovels and picks. It's hard work. Maybe they just gave up. This unfinished project theory seems quite plausible in accounting for the dead ends and the lack of features. It explains why they don't go anywhere and why they look incomplete. But it still leaves the fundamental question unanswered. What was the original intention? Why did they start digging in the first place? Was it supposed to be an escape route? Was it meant to be a storage area that was abandoned when they realized how unsuitable it was? Was it the start of a very ambitious, poorly planned spiritual retreat space? Historians still argue whether the unfinished nature of the passages implies a failed practical purpose, like escape or storage, or a concept like a spiritual journey that was simply never fully realized or abandoned when its impracticality became clear. The truth is, without more evidence, without finding the plans or tools left behind, or some contemporary written record mentioning the project, we're left guessing. And that's the real frustration of these silent, dark tunnels. They ask a question but provide no answer, leaving modern minds to endlessly speculate on the intentions of people long dead, based only on holes in the ground. It's enough to make you want to lie down and take a nap, isn't it? Picking up from that frustrating dead end, that silent shrug of an unfinished project, your mind naturally drifts to the practicalities. If this was started with some purpose, however ill-fated, how on earth did they even begin to carve these tunnels out of the earth and rock? Forget high-tech boring machines or even simple dynamite. We're talking about the Middle Ages here. The tools of the trade were basic, to say the least. Imagine yourself as one of the people given this back-breaking task. You wouldn't have a hard hat. Health and safety wasn't exactly a priority unless you counted praying you didn't get smushed. You'd be down there in the dim, flickering light of oil lamps or torches, the air thick with dust and damp earth, armed with what would feel like Stone Age technology by modern standards. Think about it. You'd have picks, heavy iron-headed picks, swung with all your might to loosen the soil and chip away at softer stone. You'd have shovels, probably simple wooden or iron scoops for scraping up the loosened material. For any harder rock, you'd be looking at hammers and chisels, painstakingly chipping away, fragment by tiny fragment. It's the kind of work that makes your hands ache just thinking about it, let alone actually doing it hour after hour, day after day. There's no power assistance, no mechanical advantage beyond leverage and brute force. Every inch gained in these tunnels represented an immense expenditure of human energy. It's hard to imagine a modern construction crew tackling something like this without a union protest within the first 5 minutes. You want us to dig how far with what? And the material had to go somewhere. As you dug, you'd fill baskets or perhaps primitive wheelbarrows if they had them suitable for underground use, which is debatable with the spoil, the dirt, the rocks, the clay. Then you'd have to haul all that material back up and out of the passage through the narrow opening and dispose of it somewhere on the surface without leaving a huge, obvious pile of dirt that screamed, "Secret digging project here." Mainstream historical fact. Medieval excavation work, whether for moats, foundations, wells, or mines, was incredibly labor-intensive, relying almost entirely on manual power, using simple hand tools like picks, shovels, and levers. The scale of some medieval earthworks and underground structures is a testament to the sheer amount of human muscle power available and expended. It makes you wonder who was doing this work. Was it the monks themselves, perhaps, as a form of penance, or communal labor? Monastic rules often mandated periods of manual work. But digging deep, dangerous tunnels seems like a specialized, potentially non-monastic task. Were hired laborers brought in? This would cost money, which factors into the abandoned due to expense theory. Historians still argue whether large-scale medieval construction projects, especially those within monasteries, were primarily completed by the resident community, paid skilled laborers, or a combination of both, depending on the specific task and wealth of the institution. The silence of the passages themselves offers no clue. No discarded tools, no identifying marks left by workers. Imagine the conditions: dark, dusty, maybe wet, depending on the water table. The air quality would be terrible. Poor ventilation means stale, perhaps even dangerous air. The constant noise of picking and scraping would echo in the confined space. It would be claustrophobic, exhausting, and potentially very dangerous, with the constant risk of collapse, falling rocks, or simply running out of breathable air deeper in. It wasn't just hard work, it was hazardous work. Quirky tidbit. While not directly related to monasteries, medieval miners sometimes believed in subterranean spirits or goblins who were blamed for collapses, tool breakages, or finding unexpectedly hard rock. Perhaps not entirely unsimilar to how you might feel about hitting a frustratingly hard patch while digging in your own garden, except their version involves supernatural beings instead of just tree roots. So you're standing there in the silence of one of these short dead-end tunnels, feeling the coolness of the rock, and you can almost hear the phantom sounds of that intense labor. The rhythmic thud of the pickaxe, the scrape of the shovel, the grunt of effort, maybe the low murmur of voices, or the coughs from the dust. You can imagine the sweat, the aching muscles, the grime under fingernails. And then suddenly the rock gets harder, much harder. The pick just bounces off with a frustrating clang. You try a hammer and chisel, chipping away maddeningly slowly. The progress grinds to a halt. What took maybe an hour to dig through softer earth now takes a day to gain an inch of solid stone. This sudden increase in difficulty, hitting a layer of bedrock or a particularly tough geological formation, is a very plausible explanation for why these passages stop where they do. If the intended goal was still a significant distance away, hitting a major obstacle like this could easily have made the project seem insurmountable, given the technology and resources available. It becomes exponentially harder, slower, and more expensive. The initial enthusiasm or perceived necessity might have waned in the face of such stubborn resistance from the earth itself. It's like deciding to build a swimming pool in your backyard, digging happily through topsoil, and then hitting solid granite 3 feet down. Suddenly, that refreshing dip seems like a lot more trouble than it's worth. Considering the sheer scale of effort already invested just to get this far, these aren't tiny crawl spaces, they're human-sized tunnels. The decision to abandon the project wouldn't have been taken lightly. A significant amount of time, labor, and potentially money had already been sunk into the ground. Giving up means all that effort was effectively for nothing. But if the cost and difficulty of proceeding became prohibitive, stopping might have been the only rational choice, however frustrating. So as you stand there feeling the cool, unfinished surfaces, you're also feeling the echoes of immense physical labor and potentially the ghost of a project that quite literally hit a wall, not just at the end, but perhaps also in its very difficult execution. The silence isn't just empty, it's heavy with the memory of effort and abandonment. So you've pictured the grinding, painful labor, the dark, dusty air, the sheer physical effort required just to make those few yards of tunnel. You felt the frustration of hitting that stubborn rock layer, the likely reason the picks and shovels finally fell silent. But even if the how they were dug is clear in its grueling simplicity, the why remains the larger, more intriguing puzzle. We transition now from the sweat and muscle of excavation to the more elusive question of intent. Why would anyone, particularly monks living a life dedicated to quiet contemplation and prayer, embark on such a seemingly pointless secret digging project in the first place? The very phrase secret passage conjures up all sorts of romanticized, often exaggerated images from history books and adventure stories. You think of castles with hidden escape routes, stately homes with sliding panels, or maybe even old smuggling tunnels running beneath coastal towns. These features existed certainly, but they were rarely as common or as elaborate as popular culture suggests. Their purpose, however, was usually quite specific and practical, even if shrouded in secrecy. Consider the classic motives for a secret passage. The most obvious is escape. In turbulent times, a hidden tunnel could be a lifeline, a way to slip away unseen if the main gates were breached, if invaders were swarming the grounds, or if unwelcome visitors arrived with less than friendly intentions. Imagine the scene. The sound of pounding on the main door, shouts echoing through the monastery walls, and a small group of people vanishing through a disguised opening in a wall or floor, descending into the darkness below, hopefully to emerge somewhere safe outside the immediate danger zone. It's a compelling image born out of necessity in a less secure era. Another common reason was concealment, not just for people, but for things. Valuables like treasure-important documents, or even relics which were immensely valuable to monasteries, might be hidden away in a secret chamber, accessible only through a passage protecting them from theft or destruction during times of conflict or political upheaval. Or perhaps the concealment was for people on the run, political dissidents, religious refugees, or even just someone trying to avoid a difficult conversation. Oh, Father Thomas, I haven't seen him around. Maybe check the scriptorium. Definitely not hiding in a secret passage under the floorboards. No, sir. Then there's the idea of discreet movement. Perhaps not for escape, but for getting from one part of a large building or complex to another without being seen. This could be for anything from smuggling contraband, less likely for monks you'd hope, but who knows, to simply allowing someone to move between sensitive areas without disrupting daily routines or attracting unwanted attention. Maybe it was the medieval equivalent of using the service stairs to avoid awkward small talk in the elevator. So let's take these common motives, escape, concealment of people or things, discreet movement, and hold them up against the reality of the tunnels you've been exploring. You stand in a short, unfinished passage ending abruptly at a rock face. Does this look like an escape route? Not really, it goes nowhere. Escaping to this tunnel would only trap you deeper underground. Could it be for concealing things? Possibly, if the intention was to create a small hidden chamber at the end. But why dig a passage to it rather than just create a secret space directly beneath a floor or behind a wall? A short passage leading to a dead end seems like an overly complicated way to achieve simple concealment. And for discreet movement, again, a passage that stops dead isn't much use for getting from point A to point B. Monasteries themselves were complex institutions and sometimes did incorporate defensive features or secure areas. They weren't immune to the dangers of the outside world. Mainstream historical fact. Many monasteries, especially in earlier or more volatile periods, were fortified to some degree, possessing strong walls, gatehouses, and sometimes internal security measures to protect their inhabitants' wealth and knowledge from bandits, rival lords, or invading forces. However, purpose-built underground escape tunnels were less common than popular myths suggest, particularly the long, elaborate ones depicted in fiction. More often, secret features might be simple bolt holes, hidden rooms, or ways to access upper floors or attics unseen. This makes the tunnels you're considering even more perplexing. They don't fit the typical mold of practical monastic architecture or known defensive features. They aren't providing access to a secure room that we can see, they aren't leading outside, and they aren't connecting distant parts of the monastery complex. Their unfinished state and lack of clear destination undermine every conventional explanation for a secret passage. It's worth remembering that the line between historical reality and folklore gets very blurry when it comes to secret tunnels. Every old building, it seems, is rumored to have one. Oh yes, the old mayor's house definitely has a tunnel to the pub. The church, supposedly, a passage runs all the way to the castle. Most of these stories turn out to be just that. Stories, often born from misunderstanding old drainage system cellars or foundations. The persistent human fascination with hidden spaces feeds these myths. Quirky tidbit. There's a persistent legend in certain parts of Europe about secret tunnels built by various groups, from smugglers to persecuted religious orders, that were supposedly designed with intricate dead ends or traps to ensnare anyone who wasn't supposed to be there, adding another layer of mystery and danger to the idea of hidden underground networks. While fun to imagine, concrete evidence for such elaborate systems is usually lacking. So are these monastery tunnels just victims of folklore applied retrospectively? Perhaps, but they undeniably exist. Someone did dig them. This leads us back to the frustrating question, why? Was it a genuine attempt at building a functional secret passage that was simply abandoned due to insurmountable difficulty? Was it for a purpose so specific and obscure that we centuries later can't even guess at it? Or was it something else entirely, maybe related to a part of monastic life we don't fully understand? Historians still argue whether these types of short, enigmatic underground features found beneath some medieval buildings represent failed attempts at conventional passages, structures related to forgotten rituals or practices, or simply misinterpreted remnants of older building phases or geological curiosities. The lack of historical records mentioning the digging of these specific tunnels only deepens the mystery, forcing us to rely on speculation and educated guesses rather than documented fact. As you mentally overlay the common historical uses of secret passages onto the silent dead-end tunnels, you can feel the lack of a clean fit. These aren't the dramatic escape routes of legend. They don't seem designed for convenient concealment of goods. They are simply holes in the ground that stop. This disconnect between the expected purpose of a secret passage and the reality of these particular tunnels is what makes them so compellingly, sleepily mundane. They promise intrigue but deliver an anti-climax mirroring perhaps the project's original fate. You're left pondering not the secrets they kept, but the failed intention behind their very creation. So you've contemplated the physical grind, the frustrating dead end of those hand-dug tunnels, and the stark lack of fit with conventional ideas of escape routes or hiding places. You've felt the quiet anti-climax of standing in a hole that goes nowhere. It leaves you with a persistent nagging question, given the effort the secrecy implied by digging underground and the sheer pointlessness of the result. Why was this undertaking even attempted? The answer, or at least the realm where the answer might lie, takes us deeper into the peculiar world of medieval monastic life. A world where the need for secrecy and separation, though perhaps different from our modern understanding, was profoundly real. Imagine yourself not as a casual visitor peering into dusty holes, but as an inhabitant of this monastery centuries ago. Your life is governed by a strict rhythm of prayer work and study dictated by the rule of your order. Every hour of the day and night has its purpose marked by the ringing of bells calling you to chapel. Your community is your world. You live in close proximity with others, sharing meals in silence, working side by side in the fields, the scriptorium, or the workshops. Privacy, as you understand it today, the idea of having a personal space where your thoughts and actions are entirely your own, is a very different concept here. Your life, to a large extent, is public within the confines of the monastery walls. Yet within this shared existence, there is a profound need for separation from the outside world. The monastery is intended to be a haven, a place set apart from the chaos, temptations, and violence of secular society. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are not just personal commitments. They are the foundation of a collective effort to live a life dedicated to God, free from worldly distractions. This deliberate separation requires boundaries. Physical walls, yes, but also rules and customs designed to minimize contact with the outside, to keep the world and its influences at bay. News from beyond the gates might arrive, visitors might be received according to the rules of hospitality, but the core of monastic life is its enclosure. This need for enclosure and separation could sometimes require discretion or even outright secrecy. Not necessarily the cloak and dagger kind, but a need to shield the community or certain aspects of its life from unwanted external interference. Think about the wealth that monasteries often accumulated in land and tithes and precious objects like reliquaries or illuminated manuscripts. This wealth made them targets. Mainstream historical fact. Monasteries were frequently recipients of gifts from kings, nobles, and wealthy patrons, and their efficient management of land and resources often made them significant economic powers in their regions. This wealth, while supporting the charitable work and spiritual mission of the monastery, also attracted the unwelcome attention of bandits, greedy lords, or even rival religious institutions. Protecting these assets was a practical necessity, sometimes requiring secure storage or discreet movement. But the need for secrecy wasn't always about external threats or protecting treasure. Sometimes it was about managing the internal dynamics or shielding the monastery from external oversight or judgment. The church hierarchy, while supportive, could also be interfering. Bishops conducted visitations, abbots attended councils, and there was always a complex web of relationships, obligations, and rivalries with other monasteries, local lords, and the wider church structure. Were there practices within this particular monastery that they preferred the bishop not know about during his next visit? Was there a person being sheltered who needed to remain hidden? Was there some internal dissent or political maneuvering? The abbot wished to keep quiet. Consider the human element. Despite the vows and the rigorous discipline, monks were still people. They brought with them the complexities of the outside world they had left behind. Family connections, past debts, political allegiances, personal failings, and sometimes deeply held beliefs that might not align perfectly with the prevailing dogma. While the ideal was perfect obedience and communal harmony, the reality could involve squabbles, rivalries, and even serious breaches of the rules. What if a monk had a secret visitor? What if someone was engaging in forbidden study or writing? What if the abbot himself had something to hide? These tunnels, crude and unfinished as they are, speak of a project that required significant effort and, crucially, secrecy from at least some within the monastery, let alone the outside world. Digging something like this is not a quiet activity. It produces noise, dust, and spoil. It requires tools and coordination. For it to have been a secret project means it was likely undertaken by a limited number of people, perhaps working at unusual hours and disposing of the spoil carefully. This level of clandestine effort suggests the secret being protected was considered profoundly important, perhaps even dangerous if revealed. Could it have been related to forbidden knowledge? Monasteries were centers of learning, but access to certain texts or ideas was often restricted. While the image of monks secretly studying forbidden magic spells in the basement is more the stuff of fantasy novels than historical reality, there were certainly texts and ideas considered controversial, heretical, or simply inappropriate for general consumption. Was there a particular manuscript perhaps acquired from a less than reputable source that the community wished to study or preserve in secret? A hidden passage to a secure hidden room could serve this purpose. Though again, the dead end makes this theory tricky. What about people? Could they have been hiding someone? Perhaps a political refugee, a former criminal seeking sanctuary, or even someone fleeing church justice. Sanctuary within a monastery was a complex legal and social concept with rules varying over time and place. Hiding someone completely off the books, perhaps even from church authorities themselves, would require a level of secrecy that a hidden passage might support, at least initially. Imagine the scene: a fugitive arrives at night, is quickly ushered into the dark opening, and the passage is concealed once more. But then what? They can't stay in a dead-end tunnel forever. So this theory only works if the passage was meant to lead to a more permanent hiding place that was never completed, or if the plan was abandoned. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that the secrecy wasn't about protecting the monastery from outside threats, but hiding something problematic within the monastery from the outside world, or even from parts of the monastic community itself. Could it relate to financial irregularities, to a breach of vows, to a power struggle between factions within the order? The history of the church, like any large human institution, has its share of scandals and secrets. Quirky tidbit: medieval monastic chronicles, while often focusing on pious lives and miracles, occasionally hint at internal strife, disciplinary issues, or conflicts with external powers, sometimes using vague language to avoid explicit condemnation or scandal. These brief oblique references can fuel speculation about what really might have been going on behind those thick stone walls. The need for discipline was paramount in monastic life. The Rule of St. Benedict, a foundational text for many Western monastic orders, emphasizes obedience, humility, and stability, staying within the monastery. Any activity that potentially undermined this discipline or introduced elements that could corrupt the community would be strictly forbidden. Digging a secret tunnel, particularly one not authorized by the abbot and chapter the governing body of the monks, would likely be a serious breach of obedience and potentially a threat to stability, introducing an element of clandestine activity contrary to the communal ideal. Unless, of course, the abbot was involved, in which case the secrecy was directed outwards or downwards within the community. Think about the sheer effort involved, the months or perhaps years of work, the constant risk of discovery. Whatever the intended purpose of these tunnels, it must have been considered worth this immense investment of labor and risk. It wasn't a casual undertaking. It wasn't a simple drainage ditch or a foundation repair. It was a deliberate hidden excavation project. This scale of effort points to a perceived need for secrecy that went beyond simply locking a door or building a thicker wall. It suggests something, or someone, needed to be hidden or moved with absolute discretion, completely outside the normal channels of monastic life. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect is that the specific nature of the secret is lost to time. Was it related to some grand political intrigue, a desperate attempt to save sacred relics from invading forces, or something far more mundane and human? An illicit affair, a cache of forbidden wine, or a secret stash of particularly comfortable slippers? Okay, maybe not the slippers, but you get the idea. The mundane can be just as compelling as the dramatic when it's hidden. The fact that the tunnels were unfinished only compounds the mystery. Did the secret resolve itself? Did the people involved get caught? Did they simply give up because the digging was too hard, leaving behind a lasting puzzle? Historians still argue whether the presence of such unexplained, unfinished, clandestine constructions beneath religious or noble buildings in the Middle Ages indicates widespread attempts at functional secret passages that were often abandoned due to practical difficulties, or if they point to more obscure, possibly ritualistic or symbolic purposes whose meaning is now lost to us. The lack of corresponding documentation means we are left piecing together possibilities based on the physical evidence and our understanding, however imperfect, of medieval society and monastic life. These tunnels are silent witnesses, not just to hard labor, but to a perceived need for a level of concealment or separation that drove someone to undertake this difficult hidden task. They are a physical manifestation of a secret, even if that secret's nature and the project's ultimate goal remain frustratingly out of reach, buried beneath centuries of time and earth. So you've pondered the deep human needs for separation and secrecy that might have existed behind those monastery walls, needs that could potentially drive someone to undertake such a clandestine project. You've felt the weight of that historical context, the layers of religious discipline, worldly entanglements, and simple human fallibility that made monastic life far from a simple, serene existence. But even armed with that understanding of why they might have wanted a secret space, the question still hangs heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of ancient dust. What exactly were these unfinished dead-end holes supposed to be for? Because as you stoop low, tracing the rough-hewn path with your fingertips, the most common, most immediate assumptions that pop into your modern head just don't work. Let's tackle the most popular theory first. The one that leaps straight from adventure novels and period dramas, escape tunnels. Ah, the classic. Picture it. The monastery is under siege. Torches flicker against the stone walls. The sound of battering rams echoes through the courtyard. Brave monks, perhaps, clutching sacred relics or important documents, slip into a hidden passage, disappearing into the earth to emerge miles away, safe and sound. It's a compelling image, isn't it? A desperate flight to freedom aided by secret engineering. But then you look again at the tunnel mouth, and you remember the outline, and you recall the dead end. An escape tunnel that stops abruptly after a relatively short distance, still well within the confines of the monastery property, perhaps even still under the main buildings, isn't much use for escaping anything, is it? Unless the plan was to escape into the comforting embrace of solid rock and clay, which, while perhaps offering a unique form of solitude, wouldn't exactly get you away from the bad guys pounding on the gate. It's like packing a suitcase for a round-the-world trip and only getting as far as your own garden shed. Not the most effective getaway plan. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval monasteries, especially wealthy and influential ones, were indeed sometimes targeted during periods of warfare, civil unrest, or even by opportunistic local lords. They often had sturdy walls and their gates could be barred, but they weren't military fortresses designed to withstand prolonged sieges like a castle might be. So the idea of needing an escape route wasn't entirely unfounded in the volatile medieval world. However, a functional escape tunnel would require meticulous planning significant length to pass under walls and potentially outer defenses, like moats, and crucially a secure hidden exit point far from the danger zone. These tunnels possess none of those characteristics. They are short, they are unfinished, and they have no discernible exit other than the one you used to crawl in. Trying to escape through here would be less dramatic getaway and more mildly inconvenient burial. All right, so not an escape route. How about storage treasure? Maybe monasteries, as we touched upon, could accumulate considerable wealth. Perhaps these were intended as secret vaults for valuables, gold chalices, silver crucifixes, jeweled reliquaries, or priceless illuminated manuscripts. Hiding them underground, accessible only through a concealed entrance, sounds like a reasonable security measure, right? A medieval safety deposit box buried deep. Again, you bump into the problem, the dead end, and the nature of the space. A treasure vault needs to be secure, yes, but also reasonably accessible to deposit and retrieve items. These tunnels are narrow, low, and difficult to navigate even when empty. Imagine trying to haul a heavy, intricately carved chest or a stack of precious books through that cramped, dusty space in a hurry. Not exactly ideal for discreet storage or rapid retrieval during a crisis. A proper secret vault would likely be a finished, perhaps stone-lined chamber, possibly with a reinforced door or other security features hidden at the end of a tunnel, not just the tunnel itself. The tunnels we're examining are simply unfinished passages of bare earth and rock ending abruptly. They look less like a vault and more like someone started digging a hole and just stopped, without putting anything valuable in it. Could they be some kind of utility passage sewers, perhaps? Or drainage? Medieval sanitation wasn't exactly known for its sophistication, but monasteries did have systems for managing waste and water. However, medieval sewers or drains were typically designed with a slope to facilitate flow, often lined with stone or brick, and connected to latrines or other waste points. These tunnels lack any lining, appear relatively level, and don't connect to any obvious sanitation points you've seen above ground. What about access to a well or cistern? Monasteries needed reliable water sources. Sometimes underground passages were used to reach wells or springs located some distance away, or to connect different parts of the water supply system. But these tunnels don't lead to any known water source, and their layout doesn't match the typical branching patterns of water channels or aqueducts of the time. They are simple, linear, and just stop. Quirky tidbit. While most medieval building was practical, aimed at survival, defense, or religious function, sometimes builders or patrons incorporated strange or seemingly unnecessary features. There are accounts of odd hidden chambers, confusing layouts meant to symbolize spiritual journeys, or even construction details that seem more superstitious than structural. The medieval mind sometimes saw utility and symbolism intertwined in ways we might find hard to understand today. Could these tunnels fall into some category of building practice or feature that simply isn't immediately obvious to us? The sheer physical effort involved also weighs heavily against some of the simpler explanations. Digging underground by hand with medieval tools was back-breaking work. It wasn't something you'd undertake lightly for a purpose that could be achieved more easily above ground. Building a secure room above ground, installing a strong lock, or even just digging a well, while still hard work, often required less specialized effort and less risk of cave-ins or structural damage than burrowing under existing buildings. The commitment to digging these particular tunnels suggests a need that couldn't be met through more conventional means. So you stand in this dusty, cramped space, feeling the silence press in on you. You've considered the most straightforward explanations, escape, treasure, utility, and found them wanting. The physical evidence just doesn't align. The tunnels are unfinished, they lead nowhere useful, and their construction doesn't match the practical needs of the proposed purposes. It's like finding a beautifully carved wooden spoon in the middle of a desert. It clearly took effort to create and place there, but its intended use, eating soup, is completely nonsensical in its current location. Historians still argue whether unexplained underground structures like these found beneath medieval sites represent failed attempts at genuinely functional passages that were abandoned due to unforeseen engineering difficulties, or if their purpose lay in something entirely different, perhaps ritualistic, symbolic, or related to clandestine activities that left no trace in the historical record. The lack of clear documentation, combined with the ambiguous nature of the physical remains, leaves ample room for interpretation and frustration for those seeking a simple answer. These tunnels are stubbornly resistant to fitting neatly into any conventional box. They demand a more complex, perhaps less practical explanation. They are a puzzle left behind by people who clearly had a reason, a powerful enough reason to dig in secret, even if that reason remains tantalizingly out of reach, just like the intended end of these mysterious passages. You are left with the physical manifestation of a significant hidden effort, a testament to a secret purpose that remains frustratingly just out of sight around the corner of a tunnel that never actually turned. You've dismissed the obvious, the practical, the explanations that fit neatly into the blueprint of a functioning medieval institution. Escape, no exit. Storage, impractical access, and empty anyway. Utility, no connections, no purpose. So if they weren't for getting out, or for putting things in long term, or for carrying water or waste what remains, you're left with the whispers, the shadow dancers of possibility, the less savory, less sanctioned activities that might require a hidden space, precisely because they couldn't happen out in the open. This is where the theories take a turn into the slightly seedier, more intriguing corners of the medieval imagination. Perhaps, just perhaps, these passages were intended not for practical visible functions, but for something clandestine, something that needed to be kept absolutely secret, smuggling, for instance. Monasteries were sometimes centers of trade and travel, strategically located on routes with resources and connections. While their main purpose was spiritual, the reality often involved earthly matters, including the movement of goods. And where there are goods, there's sometimes the temptation to move unregistered goods, avoiding tolls, taxes, or pesky regulations. Imagine it valuable silks, exotic spices, maybe even forbidden books or religious artifacts deemed heretical by the mainstream church. Could these tunnels have been part of a route to secretly bring such items into or out of the monastery? Goods could be transferred from a hidden drop point outside the walls to the entrance of the tunnel, then move silently underground to a discreet location within the monastery itself, avoiding watchful eyes at the gates or in the public areas. It's a compelling thought. The monks doubling as medieval smugglers, adding a dash of international intrigue to their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Maybe obedience didn't explicitly mention avoiding contraband saffron, but again you hit the wall, literally at the dead end. While a short tunnel might be useful for a quick transfer from a hidden point just outside the wall to just inside the wall, these tunnels seem to originate within the monastery itself, leading deeper, under the buildings, and then stopping. They don't appear to cross the outer defensive walls, and even if they did, a functional smuggling tunnel would likely need to extend a significant distance to a safe, discreet pickup or drop-off point outside the monastery grounds, away from immediate observation. These tunnels offer no such connection. Trying to smuggle anything substantial down here would feel less like a daring clandestine operation and more like playing hide-and-seek with your illegal wares in a crawl space. Quick hide, the Turkish delight brother Bartholomew is coming. Okay, if not smuggling goods, what about people's secret meetings? The medieval world was a complex web of political alliances, religious factions, and personal rivalries. Powerful individuals, nobles, church officials, even potentially figures at odds with the ruling powers, might need a secure, absolutely private place to meet away from informers, spies, or unwelcome scrutiny. A monastery, with its reputation for sanctity and often its physical isolation or secure walls, could serve as a seemingly innocent location for such a rendezvous. And within that monastery, what could be more private than a hidden passage leading to a secluded chamber? Perhaps these tunnels were meant to provide secret access to a specific room or area, allowing someone to enter or leave the monastery unseen, or allowing people already inside to move between areas without being observed. Imagine a noble secretly meeting with the abbot to discuss sensitive political matters, using a hidden entrance via the tunnels to avoid being seen arriving. Or monks meeting in secret about matters they didn't want others in the community to know about, perhaps planning a rebellion against a disliked prior, or discussing unorthodox theological views. This theory feels a little more plausible given the unfinished nature. Maybe the intention wasn't a long, complex network, but simply a short, discreet passage to a specific hidden destination within the monastery walls. A private chapel, a hidden study, a secure cellar. The dead end might simply mean the tunnel hadn't yet reached its intended destination room, or that the room itself was meant to be dug out at the end of the passage. What about other illicit activities? Gambling, for example, was officially frowned upon, especially among the clergy. But human nature is what it is. Drinking excessively, engaging in forbidden romantic relationships, discussing or practicing rituals that strayed from official doctrine. All of these activities might require secrecy, and a hidden, difficult-to-access space would be ideal. A short tunnel leading to nowhere? It could have been intended to lead to a small, concealed room where these less-than-holy pastimes could take place far from the eyes and ears of the more devout or the more observant. Mainstream historical fact. While monastic life was governed by strict rules like the Rule of St. Benedict intended to promote piety, community, and obedience, the reality often fell short. Throughout the Middle Ages, there are numerous documented instances of monastic communities facing accusations of corruption, lax discipline, political interference, and monks engaging in worldly pursuits or even criminal activities. Reform movements periodically swept through the church attempting to bring monasteries back in line with their founding ideals, which suggests the need for such reforms was unfortunately common. Monks were, after all, still human, with human failings and temptations. Consider the atmosphere down here again. It's damp, it's dark, it's silent, save for your own breathing and the faint thud of your heart. If you wanted to meet someone in secret or engage in something you shouldn't, this kind of environment amplifies the sense of clandestine activity. It feels like a place for secrets. Even if the tunnels are unfinished, the very act of digging them, of creating a hidden path, points towards a desire for concealment. Maybe the intended purpose wasn't one specific activity, but the general concept of a hidden space, a bolt hole within the monastery for whatever secret needed keeping at the time. A place to hide a person, temporarily conceal a sensitive document, or conduct a conversation that couldn't risk being overheard. The fact that the tunnels are unfinished could simply mean the need for such a space arose. The digging began, but the circumstances that necessitated it either passed or changed, or were discovered, leading to the abrupt abandonment of the project. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval buildings, not just monasteries, have been found to contain listening tubes or hidden passages built into walls or floors, sometimes running between different rooms or from a room to a discrete observation point. These weren't always for nefarious purposes. Sometimes they were for practical communication between parts of a large building or for religious purposes, like allowing someone outside a chapel to hear the service. But their existence shows a medieval comfort with incorporating hidden architectural features for specific, non-obvious functions, hinting that secret construction was not entirely alien. The sheer effort required to dig these suggests the secret was important. You wouldn't excavate this much earth and stone by hand unless the potential consequences of being discovered or the potential gain from the secret activity were significant. It wasn't a casual undertaking. Someone was highly motivated to create this hidden space, whatever its ultimate use was meant to be. Historians still argue whether archaeological evidence of unusual or hidden features in medieval religious sites, such as these tunnels, indicates widespread monastic corruption and clandestine activities, or if they represent isolated incidents, misunderstood architectural practices, or even features related to forgotten religious rituals or forms of asceticism that involve seclusion. Separating genuine evidence of wrongdoing from quirky building choices or practices that simply seem strange to our modern eyes is a constant challenge in interpreting the past. You run your hand along the rough earth wall. It feels like the imprint of a forgotten intention. Was this meant to be a path to illicit pleasure, a route for forbidden alliances, a hiding place for treasures far less holy than relics? The possibilities, while speculative, add a layer of human drama and complexity to the otherwise stark reality of these dead-end holes. They refuse to be just failed practical projects. They hint at secrets, perhaps mundane, perhaps scandalous, buried beneath the stone and piety of monastic life. You've sifted through the mundane, the potentially illicit, the human failings and practical necessities, and yet the tunnels remain silent and unyielding in their lack of obvious purpose. If they weren't for getting out, or putting things in, or conducting secret earthly business that nonetheless involved movement or storage, what possibilities are left? You're sinking deeper now, not just physically into the earth, but metaphorically into the more abstract, perhaps even spiritual interpretations. Could these passages have served a religious function? Not a grand public one, but something private, internal, perhaps even esoteric. Think about the core purpose of a monastery, a place dedicated to spiritual life, to prayer, contemplation, and often to asceticism, the practice of severe self-discipline and abstinence for religious reasons. Monks sought to withdraw from the distractions of the world to focus on God. This withdrawal wasn't always just about being behind high walls. It could involve practices aimed at mortifying the flesh, enduring discomfort, and seeking solitude even within the communal setting. Could these tunnels have been spaces for extreme asceticism? Imagine a monk choosing to spend time down here, deep underground, cut off from light, from the sounds of the monastery above, from the warmth and relative comfort of the cloister. It would be a profound act of self-denial. The dampness, the chill, the oppressive darkness, the feeling of being buried alive. These aren't exactly conducive to a Sunday picnic, are they? But for someone seeking to punish the body for the perceived good of the soul, or to achieve a state of heightened spiritual awareness through sensory deprivation and physical hardship, this environment might have seemed appealing. In a "this is truly awful, therefore it must be holy" sort of way. Perhaps they were intended as spaces for intense prayer or meditation. A place where a monk could retreat utterly, ensuring no distractions, no possibility of interruption. The silence down here is absolute, broken only by your own breath. It's the kind of silence that can either drive you mad or perhaps allow for a profound connection with the divine, depending on your mental state and dedication. You could chant down here, and the sound would be swallowed by the earth, leaving no trace above. You could kneel in the cold, damp soil for hours, contemplating the mysteries of the universe, or perhaps just wondering if anyone would notice if you snuck back up for a biscuit. The unfinished nature still poses a problem. If it was for ascetic retreat, why stop building? Were they just making more spaces for this? Did the need for extreme underground prayer suddenly decrease? Right, Nigel, that's enough subterranean flagellation for 1 year surface for soup. Or perhaps the specific kind of spiritual exercise changed. Or maybe, and this is the boring explanation, again, the digging itself was the penance. Brother Thomas, your penance is to dig a hole. When you are done, dig another one next to it. Do this until you achieve enlightenment or blistered hands, whichever comes first. Another religious possibility relates to symbolic journeys or rituals. Many religions incorporate elements of descent, in a sense symbolic death, and rebirth journeys through darkness into light. Could these tunnels represent a symbolic journey into the underworld, or a descent into the self as part of a ritual process? Perhaps initiates into a specific monastic practice or vow had to pass through these dark passages. Consider pilgrimage. While most pilgrimage involved traveling to holy sites elsewhere, there were also forms of internal pilgrimage, symbolic journeys undertaken within the confines of the monastery or church itself. Could these passages have been part of such a route, representing a spiritual path leading deeper into the sacred heart of the monastery? Even if that path currently ends abruptly in a wall of dirt, it would be a rather anticlimactic pilgrimage, wouldn't it? And here, pilgrims is the holiest spot, and it's a dead end. Mind you, don't trip on that route. Refreshments are somewhere else. Mainstream historical fact. Monastic life wasn't uniform. Different orders followed different rules and traditions. Some orders were more focused on communal life and public worship, like the Benedictines often were, while others, like the Carthusians, emphasized solitude, silence, and rigorous asceticism, with monks often living in individual cells or small hermitages even within the monastery grounds. The variety of monastic practices means that what seems unusual in one context might be less so in another, adding complexity when trying to interpret archaeological finds without clear documentation. Could these tunnels be linked to older, even pre-Christian beliefs or practices that persisted perhaps in a syncretic form within the seemingly orthodox Christian framework? This is where things get a bit more speculative, perhaps straying into folklore and fringe theories. Medieval Europe was still deeply connected to its ancient past and older beliefs about the earth, underground spaces, spirits, or even deities associated with the chthonic realms, sometimes lingered, occasionally intertwining with Christian practices in complex ways. Underground spaces have held symbolic significance across countless cultures as entrances to the underworld dwelling places of spirits or ancestor sites for initiation rituals or places of power connected to the earth itself. Could the monks have been tapping into some vestige of these older beliefs, perhaps seeking a connection to the earth, or using the passages for practices that felt more ancient and primal than daily prayers in the chapel? Quirky tidbit. Throughout history and in some cultures even today, certain caves, underground springs, or subterranean structures have been considered sacred sites, sometimes associated with healing prophecy or contact with the spiritual world. While these tunnels are artificial, the act of creating a sacred space underground isn't entirely without precedent in broader human history. Even if linking it directly to this specific monastery's tunnels is a significant leap of faith, pun intended. This theory, while intriguing, faces the same fundamental problem as the others, the dead end. If these tunnels were for a symbolic journey, where was the destination? If they were for connecting with the underworld or earth spirits, why did the path stop so soon? A journey into the depths usually implies reaching something. A sacred chamber, a hidden spring, a symbolic threshold. Here you just reach a wall of packed dirt and rock. It's less a journey and more a short, damp walk into a cupboard. A very long, very dark, very muddy cupboard. Perhaps the act of digging was the ritual, a physical manifestation of delving deep into the spiritual realm or burying worldly concerns. The effort, the darkness, the difficulty, all part of a meaningful process. The unfinished state could then represent a ritual left incomplete, a spiritual quest abandoned. Maybe the monk tasked with this particular form of penance just got really tired, or hit a rock too big to move, or decided that sitting quietly in the library was actually quite spiritual too. Historians still argue whether certain architectural anomalies or unusual spaces found in medieval religious buildings were purely functional structures whose original purpose has been lost to time and changes in practice, or if they held symbolic, ritualistic, or even magical significance that is not immediately obvious to modern interpreters, divorced from the medieval mindset and its complex layers of belief and folklore. Disentangling practicality, symbolism, and potential secrecy is incredibly difficult when the builders aren't around to explain themselves. You run your hand along the damp earth wall again. It feels less like a place of grand spiritual revelation and more like, well, a hole dug in the ground. The cold seeps into your fingertips. There's no sense of lingering sanctity, no whisper of ancient spirits, just the undeniable presence of dirt and stone. It's easy to project our own fascinations and mysteries onto the past. Secret passages evoke spies and intrigue. Underground spaces hint at forgotten rituals and the occult. But sometimes a hole is just a hole, or in this case, several holes that go nowhere. Yet the persistent lack of a practical explanation keeps these more imaginative possibilities alive. They are, after all, far more interesting than someone started digging a drain and gave up. Could these passages have been related to something even less tangible, like acoustics or resonance? Some ancient structures were built with surprising acoustic properties, sometimes for amplifying sound, sometimes for creating specific echoes or resonances thought to enhance rituals or communicate with non-physical realms. Could these tunnels, despite their rough state, have been part of some architectural experiment aimed at manipulating sound or vibration within the monastery? Unlikely given the crude construction and dead ends, but the human mind faced with a puzzle will wander down even the most improbable paths. Especially when you're trying to come up with 2,000 words about a hole in the ground. Maybe they were meant to house a secret, sacred object, not necessarily contraband like smuggled goods, but something of profound religious significance that needed to be kept utterly hidden, perhaps even from most of the monastic community itself. A powerful relic, a forbidden text, an artifact too dangerous or too holy for public display. A tunnel leading to a small hidden vault. Again, the dead end complicates this. Was the vault never built? Was the object never acquired? Or was the object the dead end itself? Behold the sacred wall of dirt. Its mysteries are profound and dusty. The silence presses in. The air feels heavy, inert. It's hard to imagine this space vibrating with spiritual energy or ancient power. It feels more like a place of abandonment, of purpose forgotten or thwarted. Yet the sheer effort points to a significant intention. Monks weren't just digging these for fun. Medieval Netflix wasn't a thing, but surely there were more engaging ways to pass the time, like illuminating manuscripts or arguing about theology. So the spiritual and ritual theories, while offering a tantalizing escape from the purely practical still struggle to fully explain the specific nature of these tunnels, particularly their unfinished state and apparent lack of a destination. They hinted intentions perhaps, but intentions that were never fully realized, or whose realization was so subtle or non-physical that it leaves no trace for the modern archaeologist to find. Or maybe they were just digging a really private spot to nap. Deep spiritual naps. You've explored the possibility of prayer penance and symbolic journeys down here, but when you think of secret underground tunnels, your mind probably goes somewhere else entirely, doesn't it? Not spiritual retreats, but escape, evasion, hiding away from danger. The classic secret passage trope. It's almost impossible to stand in a hidden tunnel under an old building, especially a monastery, and not immediately picture cloaked figures sneaking through the darkness, fleeing persecution, or perhaps stashing forbidden treasures away from prying eyes. It's a story baked into our collective imagination, fueled by countless books, movies, and whispered legends. So could these tunnels, despite their frustrating dead ends and humble construction, have been intended as a refuge? A way to get out when the going got tough, or a secure hidden spot to safeguard the monastery's most precious assets. Be they gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, powerful relics, or even important people seeking sanctuary. Imagine the scenario. The monastery is under threat. Maybe it's a warring feudal lord casting covetous eyes on the land or the wealth. Maybe it's a band of raiders, or even something more localized like a peasant revolt spilling over the abbey walls. In such a crisis, a secret way out a hidden bolt hole would seem incredibly valuable. You could picture monks, perhaps even distinguished guests or local villagers who had sought protection, being hurried down these dark passages, away from the noise and chaos, above hoping to emerge somewhere safe unseen. Or think about the valuables. Monasteries were often repositories of considerable wealth, not just in land and tithes, but in physical objects. Jeweled reliquaries, golden communion vessels, priceless texts copied by hand over generations. Hiding these in a cellar might be too risky if the attackers gained entry. An underground tunnel, its entrance concealed behind a movable stone or a false wall, could serve as a last-ditch secure deposit box. You'd push the heavy chest filled with treasures down the narrow passage knowing it was safe from plunder, at least temporarily. This theory has a certain appeal because it aligns with the general instability of the medieval period. Life wasn't always peaceful and predictable. Raids by Vikings had terrorized parts of Europe centuries before, but local conflicts, civil wars, and outright banditry remained constant possibilities. A monastery often situated in a position of local prominence and possessing resources could easily become a target. Providing refuge and securing its own assets would have been a practical concern for the abbot in the community. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe, particularly during periods like the anarchy in England, 12th century or the 100 Years' War, 14th, 100th, and 15th centuries, or even during more localized power struggles, saw frequent instances of castles, towns, and even monasteries being attacked, besieged, and plundered. While fortifications were the primary defense, having ways to hide or escape could be a desperate last-minute option. You stand in the tunnel and try to see it through that lens. Is this a secret escape route? You shuffle forward a few steps. The passage is damp, uneven underfoot. The air is cool, thick with the smell of wet earth. You reach the dead end again, a solid wall of dirt and rock. And this is where the secret passage theory starts to crumble, quite literally, like the earth around you. An escape route that goes nowhere isn't much of an escape route. It's more of a trap. Imagine trying to flee down here with attackers closing in only to hit a wall. Right, lads, new plan. We surrender, or perhaps we start digging really fast with our bare hands. Anyone got a spoon? If it was for hiding valuables again, the dead end is problematic. How do you get them back out once the danger has passed? You'd have to dig the whole thing open again, presumably from the entry point, which defeats the purpose of a quick, discreet retrieval. Unless, of course, the plan was to just leave them there permanently, which seems inefficient for a monastery that needed its assets to function. What about hiding people? Cramming frightened monks or civilians down here, only for them to find themselves walled in. It's a terrifying thought. You picture faces pale with fear in the flickering light of a single lamp, the sound of distant conflict fading replaced by the oppressive silence, and the dawning horror of realizing there is no way out. Not exactly a comforting refuge. More like a pre-dug mass grave, albeit one the inhabitants had to finish digging themselves. Furthermore, a truly effective escape tunnel would ideally have multiple well-hidden exit points leading far away from the immediate danger zone, perhaps into a nearby wood by a riverbank or into a separate defensible structure. These tunnels, as far as anyone can tell, don't have that. They seem to originate within the monastery's footprint and simply stop. The entrances themselves are another question. Were they truly secret? Medieval builders were skilled, and concealing doorways was certainly possible. But maintaining that secrecy over years or centuries, especially in a structure like a monastery, with people constantly moving around and working, would be a challenge. A frequently used escape route, even for drills, would risk exposure. A rarely used one might collapse or become impassable over time, like these seem to have. Perhaps the idea was to use them during a siege, not necessarily to escape entirely, but to move unseen within the monastery grounds, perhaps to reinforce a different section of the wall or to reach a hidden store of supplies. But again, the limited length and dead ends make even this sort of internal movement seem unlikely. Most strategic movement during a siege would happen above ground, behind fortified walls. Quirky tidbit. While grand elaborate escape tunnels from monasteries are mostly the stuff of fiction and local folklore, often tied to legends of hidden treasures or forbidden romances, some medieval buildings, including castles and town walls, did incorporate smaller discreet postern gates or sallyports. These weren't extensive tunnels, but small, easily defended doorways that allowed a few people to sneak out, or in undetected perhaps for reconnaissance, or to gather help, and they almost always led outside the main defensive perimeter. The scale and internal nature of these monastery tunnels don't quite fit that pattern. The possibility remains that these tunnels were intended to be much grander, much longer, perhaps eventually leading to a safe external point, but the project was abandoned before completion. This brings us back to the persistent question, why was it stopped? Did the threat pass? Did they run out of money, labor, or enthusiasm? Did the ground prove too difficult to dig through? Or did someone simply look at the damp, narrow, dead-end hole they'd created and think, you know what, maybe we'll just take our chances upstairs with the big wooden door? The sheer impracticality of these specific tunnels as effective escape routes or secure hiding places is a strong argument against the theory. The romantic notion of the secret passage is powerful, but the reality of these muddy dead-end holes suggests they were either a very poorly conceived plan for escape or intended for something else entirely. Or perhaps, and this is the boring truth, again, the project was simply an ambitious failure, a half-finished idea abandoned like so many building projects throughout history. Maybe the abbot had a moment of clarity. Wait, we're digging under the walls. Shouldn't we be making them taller? Historians still argue whether the numerous anecdotal tales and local legends about secret tunnels connecting medieval castles, churches, and monasteries have any basis in reality, or if they are largely folklore generated by the visible remains of practical but confusing features, like old drains, cellars, or mining shafts combined with a desire for exciting, hidden histories. Archaeological evidence for extensive functional secret escape tunnels in medieval buildings is surprisingly rare compared to the prevalence of the stories. You run your hand along the rough earth wall. It doesn't feel like a path to freedom. It feels like being stuck. You can almost hear the faint echo of that hypothetical monk hitting the dead end, sighing and turning back towards the noise he was trying to escape. The only thing these tunnels seem good for hiding right now is you if you wanted to avoid doing laundry for a bit. Even then, someone would probably find you eventually cold and covered in dirt. So while the idea of a secret passage for escape or hiding is immediately appealing and fits the general historical context of occasional danger, the specific limiting characteristics of these tunnels, the dead ends, the scale, the apparent lack of external exits, make it a theory that struggles to hold up under scrutiny It's a great story, but maybe not the right story for this particular unfinished underground space. Unless the secret was that they didn't actually have a useful secret passage, and this was just a very elaborate bluff. Yes, yes, we have tunnels. Very secret, don't ask where they go. Perhaps they were for hiding one very small, very unimportant object that the monks immediately forgot about. Or maybe they were intended to connect to another building that was never built. Or maybe the monks just really enjoyed digging, and this was their version of extreme underground gardening, cultivating darkness. Whatever the initial intention behind these tunnels, if it was escape or hiding, it seems the plan was either fundamentally flawed or simply never completed to a functional state. The mystery deepens the further you explore the lack of purpose. You've dismissed the romantic notion of secret escape routes, which is probably for the best, because honestly, getting trapped in a dead-end tunnel during a raid sounds like a particularly unpleasant way to go. So if they weren't for sneaking out or hiding crowns, what about something less dramatic? Something useful. Medieval monasteries, like any large, busy institution, needed space. Lots of space, for storing all sorts of things. Food supplies, equipment, perhaps even raw materials. Imagine the sheer volume of stuff required to keep a community of monks, plus their lay brothers, servants, and occasional guests fed, clothed, and housed. There would be grain from the fields, wine from the vineyards if they had them, and many did cured meats. Dried fish, cheese, wool, tools, timber, stone, parchment, ink, candles, vestments. The list goes on. Storage space was at a premium. Cellars, attics, outbuildings. They'd be crammed full. So could these tunnels have been simply extra storage? A medieval version of renting a self-storage unit, but underground and slightly less accessible. Storing things underground has some natural advantages even today. The temperature tends to be more stable, cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. This is great for preserving certain foodstuffs like root vegetables, cheese, or of course wine. Maybe these tunnels were intended as a very specific kind of larder or cellar. You could picture monks carefully carrying sacks of potatoes or barrels of ale down the narrow passage, stacking them against the walls, relying on the cool, damp air to keep things fresh, or at least less likely to spoil completely in a hurry. Security is another angle, though, perhaps for less precious items than we considered before. If the main storerooms were accessible to everyone working in the monastery, maybe these tunnels were for items that needed a little more control, perhaps valuable foodstuffs or specific tools used by only a few people. Hiding them slightly off the beaten path behind a concealed entrance, even if the passage itself led nowhere, important, might have deterred casual pilfering. Where's the abbot's fancy spiced wine? Oh, probably down. That way somewhere. Good luck finding it. However, once again, the physical characteristics of these tunnels raise questions. They are narrow, often low-ceilinged, and the floor is uneven earth. This isn't exactly ideal for moving heavy barrels or stacking large crates efficiently. It would be slow, back-breaking work. And the dead ends. How do you access the stuff stored at the far end without crawling over everything else? It feels more like a place you'd put things you hoped you wouldn't need to access very often, or perhaps just temporary overflow storage. Look, we've got nowhere else to put these turnips until harvest season is over. Shove them down the hole. Maybe the storage was meant to be long-term or for items needed only in emergencies. Imagine casks of emergency water or preserved food hidden away just in case the monastery was cut off. Or perhaps specialized supplies for specific crafts practiced by the monks, like pigments for illuminating manuscripts or rare herbs for the infirmary. Items that didn't need daily access but required a secure, stable environment. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval monasteries were centers of production and storage functioning, much like self-sufficient estates. They cultivated land, raised livestock, brewed ale, made wine, processed food, produced textiles, and often had workshops for various crafts like masonry, carpentry, and metalworking. Extensive storage facilities, including cellars, granaries, and larders, were essential parts of their architecture and daily life. But then you consider the effort involved in digging these tunnels in the first place. Was it really the most efficient way to create storage space? Couldn't they have built a larger cellar, a new barn, or expanded an existing storeroom above ground, or even just slightly below the surface with easier access. Digging underground tunnels is hard work, especially with medieval tools. The energy expenditure for what seems like inefficient storage space feels disproportionate, unless, of course, the intention was something different altogether. What about burials? Monasteries had cemeteries usually outside the church, but important individuals, particularly abbots, founders, or wealthy patrons, were often buried within the church itself or in crypts beneath it. These tunnels extending away from the main buildings, could they have been related to burial practices? Perhaps they were intended as crypts that were never finished or used. You picture niches carved into the earth walls waiting for stone sarcophagi or simple wooden coffins. Monasteries accumulated remains over centuries. Space could become an issue even in a cemetery. Could these have been planned as an overflow burial area or a place for storing ossified remains moved from elsewhere? Or maybe they were simple burial places for less prominent individuals, monks perhaps, who were interred directly into the earth in a less formal manner than those buried in the cloisters or the nave. You imagine the solemn procession, the body lowered into the damp earth of the tunnel, the final prayers whispered in the echoing dark before the passage was sealed. Or perhaps not sealed if it was intended for multiple interments over time. The idea of burial fits the subterranean nature of the tunnels and the solemnity associated with monasteries. It provides a potential purpose that doesn't require external access or complex layout, especially if it was a series of individual burial niches carved along the sides of the passages, rather than a single large crypt. However, finding evidence would be key. Have any remains been found in these tunnels? Any signs of excavation, consistent with graves or crypts? Without such findings, it remains speculation. And again, the structure itself is peculiar for a dedicated burial space. A narrow, winding tunnel leading to a dead end isn't a typical layout for a crypt designed to hold numerous burials or allow for access and commemoration. Crypts were usually more structured, vaulted chambers. These tunnels feel more like, well, tunnels dug through dirt. Perhaps they were meant to be simpler burials just dug directly into the floor or walls, and any remains have simply long since decomposed or been removed by natural processes or later disturbance. It's a possibility, but again, one without direct evidence based on the description of empty dead-end passages. Could they have been used for something more mundane and less spiritual than storage or burial drains, perhaps? But drainage systems in medieval monasteries, while extensive, usually followed the natural slope of the land and led away from the buildings, carrying wastewater or surface runoff. These tunnels seem to be relatively horizontal and lead nowhere externally. They might collect water within themselves, which seems counterproductive for drainage. What about quarrying? Monasteries often needed stone for construction and repairs. Could these tunnels be exploratory shafts or small quarries dug beneath the monastery? However, quarrying usually leaves specific signs, tool marks, evidence of stone extraction, perhaps different geological layers being exploited. And digging under buildings for stone would be risky and structurally unsound compared to opening a quarry nearby. Maybe they were related to water supply, seeking underground springs or creating cisterns, but this would typically involve shafts or larger lined chambers, not narrow horizontal tunnels ending abruptly. Unless, of course, they were seeking water and just didn't find it. They dug and dug, got tired, hit a wall, and gave up. The led nowhere aspect could apply literally to a failed search for a water source. Quirky tidbit: medieval monasteries sometimes had surprisingly complex infrastructure, including sophisticated water management systems, heated floors, hippocausts, a Roman technology occasionally adopted, and even early forms of plumbing or sanitation. But these were usually purpose-built structures easily identifiable by their function and materials, not just raw earth tunnels. So you stand in the damp passage considering these more pragmatic possibilities. Storage maybe, but inefficiently. Burial possible, but no evidence. Drainage, quarrying water, unlikely based on the form and lack of egress. The mundane theories, while less exciting than secret passages, often fit the reality of historical sites better than dramatic legends. People in the Middle Ages were practical. They dug holes for reasons: to build, to bury, to store, to drain, to find resources. But these tunnels still feel odd. Too much effort for poor storage, too unstructured for typical burial chambers, too disconnected for drainage or resource extraction. Their very lack of connection, the fact that they simply stop, is the most defining feature. It screams unfinished project or abandoned experiment, more than fully functional, albeit unconventional storage or burial space. Historians still argue whether mundane features like old cellars, unfinished excavations, or collapsed structures are the true origin of many local legends about secret tunnels under historical buildings, suggesting that practicality and abandonment are often more likely explanations than deliberate mysterious construction for hidden purposes like escape or clandestine activities. Perhaps the simplest explanation is the correct one. They started digging for some practical purpose. Storage, burial space, finding water, who knows, and then stopped. Maybe the ground became too hard. Maybe the water table was hit. Maybe funding ran out. Maybe the need for the space disappeared. Or maybe the abbot who ordered the digging died and his successor had different priorities. The tunnels were just left, an underground equivalent of a half-built extension or a forgotten shed. This doesn't make for a very thrilling bedtime story, does it? Tonight we explore the secret monastery tunnels that were probably just a really bad place to keep potatoes, and then they stopped digging. You sigh, but history, especially the history you find under the ground, is often less about swashbuckling monks and more about damp dirt and abandoned projects. These tunnels might represent nothing more mysterious than a change of plans, a failed idea, or a moment when medieval practicality collided with unexpected difficulty, resulting in, well, these holes. Empty, quiet, and leading absolutely nowhere. You've resigned yourself, perhaps a little sadly, to the idea that these damp, silent tunnels are probably not the setting for a thrilling historical drama involving hidden treasures or desperate escapes. The prevailing theory, dull as it may seem, leans towards some kind of failed or abandoned practical purpose. And building on that quite literally, perhaps these tunnels weren't intended to serve a purpose after the monastery was finished, but were actually part of the construction process itself. Imagine the scene centuries ago. This monastery, a massive undertaking of stone and faith, was being built piece by painstaking piece. Forget modern cranes and diggers. This was all manual labor, sweat muscle, and basic tools. Huge amounts of excavation were needed just to lay the foundations for such a structure. You picture lines of laborers, perhaps lay brothers, or hired hands digging into the earth with shovels, picks, and simple levers. It was backbreaking work often performed in challenging conditions. Could these tunnels be related to the foundations? Medieval foundations weren't always just simple trenches. For large or heavy structures, especially churches or complex buildings, they might involve significant excavations, sometimes going quite deep to find stable ground, or even creating substructures like crypts or extensive cellars that formed the base of the building above. Perhaps these tunnels were exploratory digs searching for the best soil layers to support the weight of the monastery walls. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of picks hitting earth and stone, the grunts of effort, the shouts of instruction echoing down the muddy shafts. Maybe they were test bores, little horizontal shafts dug to see what lay beneath the surface before committing to a major excavation project. All right, Brother Thomas, dig sideways here for a bit. Let's see if we hit bedrock or just more clay. And try not to lose your lamp again. The abbot needs that beeswax. Ifirm, they might have dug a certain distance, found unsuitable ground, too wet, too soft, too rocky, and simply abandoned that particular effort, moving the proposed foundation line or trying a different spot. The dead end in this case would simply be where they stopped digging when the test failed or was no longer needed. Or perhaps they were part of a larger planned underground structure. A more extensive cellar, a crypt, or a network of passages intended for future use, but that was simply never completed. Maybe the design changed, funding ran out, or priorities shifted. You can picture architects' plans scratched onto parchment, perhaps showing a grand subterranean level that was only partially realized before the project stalled or was revised. These tunnels could be the unfinished arms of that larger aborted plan. They started digging outwards, intending to connect them or hollow out chambers, but the work stopped midway. Consider the sheer scale of a medieval monastery construction. It was often a project spanning generations. Plans could change drastically over time. The initial design might call for a large crypt under the choir, requiring extensive excavation and potentially connecting tunnels for access during the build, or even just exploratory passages to determine the best way to dig the main crypt chamber. If the choir construction was delayed, altered, or halted, these preliminary tunnels could have been simply left as they were forgotten as the focus shifted to other parts of the monastery. Another possibility is that these tunnels were dug for the specific purpose of moving materials or spoil during the construction of the main buildings, particularly if working in a confined area or if they were excavating deep cellars or foundations. Imagine the logistical nightmare of hauling tons of earth and stone up and out of a deep pit using only buckets and ropes. Sometimes digging a horizontal tunnel from the base of the excavation to an external point or to another more accessible part of the site could be a slightly more efficient, though still incredibly arduous way to remove material. You picture workers pushing wheelbarrows filled with dirt through the narrow passages, maybe illuminated by flickering torches, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp earth. However, for this to work effectively, the tunnels would need an exit point. The fact that these passages end abruptly within the monastery grounds, leading nowhere externally, or even to a convenient dump site, makes this less likely as a primary purpose, unless the external exit was also never completed or collapsed, or was deliberately sealed later. Perhaps they planned to break through to the outside but abandoned the idea, leaving the tunnels as dead ends. What about tunnels dug under existing structures for underpinning or repair work? Older parts of the monastery might have needed their foundations reinforced or repaired as heavier structures were added above. This could involve tunneling beneath the walls to access the foundation level. But again, such tunnels would typically be linked to specific structural points and either filled in after the work was done or incorporated into a new foundation system. The random nature and dead ends seem less consistent with precise structural repair work. Perhaps they were simply quarrying stone directly beneath the site, as mentioned earlier, but more specifically for the construction rather than general resource extraction. If the stone quality proved poor or a better source was found nearby, the underground quarrying effort could have been abandoned. You'd expect to see more evidence of stone working, though. Discarded blocks, tool marks specifically related to cutting stone from a rock face. The description seems to be of tunnels dug through earth, not necessarily solid rock suitable for building stone. Let's consider the environment and challenges of medieval tunneling. It wasn't just hard work, it was dangerous. Without modern supports, tunnels were prone to collapse, especially when dug through unstable soil. Gas pockets could form, ventilation was poor, and working in the dark with rudimentary lighting was hazardous. Every foot gained was a risk, so if they encountered difficult ground instability or safety issues, abandoning the dig would have been a very rational decision. Right, Cuthbert, this soil is getting a bit crumbly. And did you hear that groaning sound? Yeah, let's just fill this bit in and pretend we didn't dig here, shall we? You imagine the sigh of relief among the laborers when a project like this was called off. Maybe the tunnels were related to underground heating systems or flues. Some monasteries had sophisticated hypocaust systems inherited from Roman times where hot air circulated under floors. However, these systems usually involve purpose-built brick or stone channels, not rough-hewn earth tunnels. And again, they would need inlets and outlets for the hot air and smoke, not dead ends. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval monastery construction was often the largest and most complex building project in a region requiring skilled masons, carpenters, engineers, and a large workforce of laborers. The logistics of sourcing materials, excavating foundations, and erecting massive stone structures were significant challenges, often taking decades or even centuries to complete, fully leading to varying architectural styles and potential changes in plans over time. Think about the sheer duration of these building projects. A monastery started in the 11th century might still be under construction or undergoing major renovations in the 14th. Generations of abbots, master builders, and workmen would come and go. Knowledge could be lost, plans misplaced, and original intentions forgotten or superseded. It's entirely plausible that a project started early on. Perhaps an ambitious plan for a vast undercroft or a system of access tunnels for the initial build was simply abandoned partway through due to changing circumstances, financial constraints, or a shift in architectural fashion. Perhaps the tunnels were exploratory for entirely different reasons related to the build. Looking for specific types of clay for mortar or pottery needed on site, or trying to locate the water table accurately for sinking wells elsewhere. But the description of tunnels leading nowhere makes these less likely as primary functions, unless again the exploration was unsuccessful and abandoned. Let's go back to the foundations idea. It's possible these were associated with a specific failed attempt to lay foundations for a wing or a tower that was never built or was later built elsewhere. Monasteries grew organically, adding chapels, cloisters, infirmaries, guest houses over time. Each addition required new foundations. Maybe these tunnels represent a specific isolated failure in that ongoing expansion process. We were going to put the new chapter house here, but Brother Ignatius says the ground is too soft after digging those holes. Oh, well, let's try over there instead. The sheer effort involved in digging these tunnels, even if they are only 150 feet long and 3 to 4 feet wide, represents significant labor. That labor wouldn't have been undertaken lightly. There must have been a perceived purpose, even if that purpose ultimately proved unfeasible or was abandoned. A construction-related purpose fits the context of a large building project. It explains the excavation activity beneath or near the main structures. It explains the dead ends if the project was halted. Imagine the master builder standing on the surface, perhaps consulting a plan pointing down at the spot where the tunnel entrance is now hidden. Yes, dig inwards, there may be 50 paces. See if the ground holds firm for the west wall footing. We'll need good stable rock. And the workers digging day after day until they hit a patch of loose sand, a sudden influx of water, or maybe just got told to stop because the stone deliveries for the walls hadn't arrived yet. Quirky tidbit. Medieval builders often used ingenious, sometimes surprisingly complex temporary wooden structures like scaffolding, centering for arches, and even cranes powered by tread wheels to construct stone buildings. While underground work was less visible, it also relied on practical, often experimental methods, and the lack of advanced surveying tools meant a lot of trial and error was involved in finding suitable ground or levels. Historians who study medieval architecture and construction techniques often analyze the physical evidence left behind, tool marks, types of stone, and mortar structural anomalies, to understand how buildings were planned and erected. Finding unexplained underground features like these tunnels would spark intense debate about their original intent and how they fit into the known construction phases of the monastery. Historians still argue whether certain enigmatic subterranean features found beneath medieval buildings represent deliberate functional elements of the original design, perhaps related to complex drainage, early heating, or forgotten service passages, or are merely the abandoned remnants of exploratory excavations, failed foundation attempts, or even collapsed earlier structures that were never fully cleared. So as you contemplate the possibility, you see the tunnels not as places of secret rendezvous or hidden hoards, but as ghosts of effort, forgotten scars on the earth left by the builders. They represent a moment in the monastery's long history when plans were made, labor was invested, and for reasons unknown, the project was simply halted. They are the underground equivalent of a drawing board sketch that never became reality or a building foundation laid but never built upon. It's a less dramatic narrative than tales of escaping monks or hidden relics, but it rings with a certain historical truth. Construction projects, even grand ones like medieval monasteries, were messy, pragmatic affairs filled with challenges, setbacks, and unfinished business. These tunnels could be precisely that, the quiet, forgotten evidence of a construction plan that began with ambition and ended abruptly underground, leading literally nowhere but speaking volumes about the realities of medieval building. They are a reminder that not every hole dug in the past had a grand, completed purpose. Sometimes you just stop digging. So you've peered into the darkness, you've taken those careful steps, felt the damp, cool air, seen the rough-hewn rock walls illuminated by your flickering light, and you've reached the end. Not an end, but the end. A solid wall, a dead stop. Every passage, every branch you followed down there led to the same maddening conclusion: nowhere. This isn't a tunnel to somewhere, it's a tunnel of nowhere. And that's where the real fun, or perhaps the real sleepy frustration, begins for the folks who actually study these things. The discovery itself was anticlimactic. Remember? A pickaxe through a wall, a quiet, Huh. But the interpretation, oh, that's where the quiet debates start humming in dusty university halls and hushed conference rooms like academic cicadas just waking up. The immediate question everyone asks once the disappointment of no treasure subsides is the obvious one. Why would anyone expend the considerable effort to dig these passages? Think about the sheer labor involved, especially centuries ago. You're not just carving into soft earth. You're dealing with rock, possibly hard clay, navigating potential collapses, needing light and ventilation, primitive as they might have been, and somehow disposing of all the excavated material without leaving giant spoil heaps that would give away your secret project. This wasn't a quick weekend DIY project. This was a serious undertaking requiring planning resources and dedicated effort for something that stops abruptly. Naturally, theories abound, each one debated, picked apart, and often dismissed with a polite cough by experts who prefer their historical mysteries to have, well, more evidence. One of the initial more romantic ideas, the kind you see in old adventure movies, was that it was some sort of escape route. Monasteries, especially in certain periods, were vulnerable. They held valuable things, relics, manuscripts, wealth, and their residents weren't exactly trained ninjas. Perhaps these passages were meant as a secret bolt hole in case of attack by Vikings or bandits, or rival lords, or even just particularly enthusiastic tax collectors. You picture the monk's robes hitched up scrambling down into the dark as chaos erupts above. But then you hit that wall. A dead end isn't a great escape route, is it? Quick, everyone flee down here. And sigh. Wait for them to find us. Unless the idea was just to hide underground for a while and hope the bad guys got bored and left. Even then, a few dozen meters of tunnel doesn't offer much in the way of long-term refuge. You'd need supplies, ventilation, maybe a small underground library. You know, for comfort reading during your siege. This theory tends to crumble faster than the mortar in the passages themselves. Another possibility, one that fits a bit more with the contemplative nature of monastic life, is that these passages were related to spiritual practice. Monks often sought solitude not just in their cells, but sometimes in more extreme ways. Hermitages, anchor holds attached to churches, even voluntary isolation within the monastery grounds were common. Could these tunnels have been intended as places for intense meditation, penance, or solitary prayer cut off from the world above? The darkness, the silence, the oppressive weight of the earth above you? It certainly creates an atmosphere conducive to introspection, maybe a little too much introspection, depending on your tolerance for enclosed spaces and existential dread. You can imagine a monk wrestling with some theological puzzle or personal failing, descending into the earth to find God, or at least a break from Bartholomew's snoring in the next cell over. The sheer pointless nature of the passages might even already carne to this theory. The journey isn't to a destination, but is the penance or the meditative process itself. Like a very, very literal spiritual journey that goes absolutely nowhere physically. However, critics of this idea point out the practicality or lack thereof. Digging such a space specifically for solitary prayer seems incredibly inefficient compared to, say, building a small quiet shed in the garden or dedicating a particularly remote corner of the monastery. And why multiple branches all leading to dead ends? Did different monks have preferred dead ends? Ah yes, Father Thomas likes the third dead end on the left. Father Michael prefers the one near the entrance, says it feels less final. It seems excessive for mere quiet reflection. Plus again the effort. Building a stone chapel is one thing. Burrowing into the earth like a particularly devout mole is quite another. While monastic life was certainly full of seemingly eccentric practices to the modern mind, this particular form of subterranean piety feels like a stretch for many historians. A mainstream historical fact that complicates things here is that monasteries did sometimes have tunnels for pragmatic reasons. These might be for drainage, for accessing remote parts of the grounds securely, for smuggling goods, though less common than legend suggests, or for connecting different buildings discreetly, particularly in larger complexes. For example, Fountains Abbey in England has extensive underground water culverts that are engineering marvels of their time. These served a clear functional purpose. The tunnels at this French monastery, however, seem to serve no such purpose. They don't connect buildings, they don't drain anything, and they don't go anywhere useful. Their existence without function is the core of the puzzle. It's like finding a beautifully crafted key that doesn't fit any lock and doesn't open anything, just sits there, being a key. One quirky or fringe tidbit sometimes brought up involves local folklore or rumors about the monastery that might have existed centuries ago. Were there whispers of strange occurrences on the grounds? Were there stories of secret activities or hidden cults associated with the monastery's past? Sometimes the digging of tunnels or hidden chambers in historical sites is linked to clandestine groups, perhaps even pre-Christian practices that went underground literally after the spread of Christianity. This is, of course, highly speculative, usually lacking any concrete evidence and bordering on conspiracy theories. But the existence of these pointless tunnels does invite such wilder ideas. Maybe it wasn't for prayer, maybe it was for, well, something the historical record politely forgot to mention. Sacrifices to an ancient earth god, meetings of a secret society of monks who moonlighted as underground spelunkers. The possibilities are endless and frankly unsupported by anything found. In the tunnels, which you'll remember, contained absolutely nothing except dirt and disappointment. So historians still argue whether these passages were intended for spiritual discipline, pragmatic but abandoned function, or something else entirely lost to time. The lack of artifacts is a significant silence. Usually, even in unfinished or abandoned historical projects, you find something. A dropped tool, a discarded lunch scrap, okay? Maybe not lunch scraps from the Middle Ages, but you get the idea. Masons mark anything that speaks of human activity. The emptiness of these tunnels is almost as loud as their presence is baffling. It suggests either a remarkable level of tidiness by the diggers, or that the activity ceased very abruptly and nothing was left behind. Could they have been part of an unfinished construction project? This is perhaps the most pragmatic, if still unsatisfying, explanation. Maybe the monks intended to build something underground, a crypt extension, a new cellar, a secure storage area, or even the start of that escape tunnel that actually went somewhere. They started digging, perhaps encountered unexpected rock formations. Those dead ends could mark where they hit solid, unyielding bedrock, or ran out of funds, or were struck by plague, or simply decided it was too much effort for too little gain. Work stopped, the entrance was discreetly covered up, perhaps during a later renovation, which is why the late 20th century workmen found it and the project was forgotten. This theory has a certain mundane appeal, fitting with the overall lack of drama surrounding the tunnels. It's less Da Vinci Code and more project canceled due to unforeseen geological issues. However, even this theory has holes. Why dig multiple parallel or branching passages if you're just starting one large chamber or tunnel? It seems inefficient, unless they were exploring different routes to see which was easiest, or perhaps different teams were working simultaneously. It's plausible, certainly more so than a secret society sacrificing voles to Cthulhu, but it still leaves a faint whiff of why. You can almost hear the imaginary monastery project manager sighing. Right, Cuthbert, you dig here. Bernard, you try over there. See who hits fewer rocks. The first one to make meaningful progress wins. Our eternal gratitude, probably. And then Cuthbert and Bernard both just hit walls. End of project. Pack up the picks. Another aspect to consider is the potential ceremonial or symbolic purpose distinct from everyday spiritual practice. Were these passages part of an initiation ritual? Some ancient orders, even within Christianity, incorporated symbolic journeys or descents. Going underground can represent a descent into the self, into darkness, before finding light, or even a symbolic death and rebirth. Could novices have been required to navigate these dark, confusing passages as part of their entry into the monastic community? The dead ends could symbolize the futility of worldly pursuits or the ultimate mystery of faith, or just the fact that sometimes in life you hit a wall. This leans back towards the spiritual theories but frames it in a more ritualistic context. The lack of any features within the tunnels, no markers, no symbols carved into the walls, no altars, even small ones, makes this harder to argue convincingly, but the possibility lingers in the absence of better explanations. You can imagine the historians gathered around a table, scattered with dusty maps and blurry photographs of the tunnel interiors. One sips lukewarm coffee. So, unfinished escape route. Another shakes their head. Doesn't explain the branches. A third pipes up. Spiritual discipline. The first sighs. Maybe, but seems like a lot of digging for quiet time. A fourth, perhaps, a younger, more speculative sort, leans forward. Could it be related to, and here they lower their voice conspiratorially, local geological anomalies? Were they trying to reach an underground spring that dried up? Or perhaps investigate a strange sound they heard coming from the earth? This gets you into even fringier territory, but the sheer mystery of the tunnels allows for almost any speculation. You start picturing monks with divining rods wandering around the grounds looking for a good place to start digging their pointless tunnels. The prevailing view, if there can be said to be one, often circles back to the idea of an unfinished project, perhaps combined with an initial, somewhat naive or overly ambitious goal. Maybe they thought they could dig an escape tunnel or a connection to a nearby cave system or a more convenient route to a distant part of the property, and simply stopped when they realized the difficulty was too great or the goal wasn't worth the effort. It's less exciting than secret rituals or hidden treasure, but history, particularly the history of everyday life and work, is often less exciting than we hope. People start projects they don't finish all the time. Medieval monks were probably no different, though their unfinished projects tended to involve a lot more heavy lifting and less flat-pack furniture. Ultimately, the tunnels remain a stubborn historical enigma. They exist. They were dug with considerable effort. They go nowhere, and they hold no clues within themselves about why they were dug. Every theory proposed has weaknesses countered by the lack of supporting evidence. It's a perfect historical puzzle because it presents a clear fact: the tunnels are there and absolutely no explanation for it. It forces you to confront the limitations of historical inquiry. Sometimes the past simply doesn't leave behind the answers we crave, and that in a weird, sleepy way is its own kind of profound message. Some secrets, even seemingly simple ones like, why dig a hole, are kept perfectly by time and stone. So you've walked the length of these enigmatic passages, felt the damp stone beneath your fingertips, breathed that cool, earthy air, and arrived repeatedly at a solid, unyielding wall. You've considered the possibilities: escape route, prayer cell, storage space, unfinished project, maybe even something stranger, something whispered in dusty folklore. And yet none of it quite fits. None of it screams, yes, that's it. The evidence, or rather the profound lack of evidence within the tunnels themselves, leaves every theory hanging tentative and unproven. And that, paradoxically, is precisely where the mystery finds its enduring power. It's the frustration of the unknown, isn't it? You're wired to seek answers, to connect the dots, to build a coherent narrative. It's how your brain makes sense of the world. Faced with something as concrete as a hole dug in the ground, you instinctively look for the reason. But here the reason remains stubbornly out of sight, buried perhaps deeper than the tunnels themselves. This isn't like finding a lost diary that explains everything, or deciphering an inscription that reveals a long-lost purpose. This is like finding a diary where all the pages are blank except for a single enigmatic doodle of a shovel leaning against a brick wall. Infuriating, right? Think about other historical mysteries. The pyramids, monumental, yes, but their purpose tombs mostly, and construction methods, while debated in specifics, are broadly understood within the context of Egyptian beliefs and capabilities. Stonehenge alignment with celestial bodies, likely ceremonial methods debated, but again a framework exists. Even something truly baffling like the Antikythera mechanism. Complex, yes, but clearly a sophisticated astronomical calculator. These objects pose questions of how, or exactly why, or who, but their fundamental nature is usually discernible. These tunnels, however, are different. Their fundamental nature seems to be pointlessness. They are tunnels that go nowhere, contain nothing, and relate to no known practice or structure in any obvious way. It's the historical equivalent of finding a perfectly preserved, clearly manufactured widget from the Middle Ages, analyzing its composition and structure, and concluding it does absolutely nothing. It has no moving parts, no sharp edges, no container function, no communicative purpose. It just is. And the lack of function makes the existence the central puzzle. This lack of a clear answer is precisely why the monastery, and particularly these subterranean features, continue to capture the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and local enthusiasts. It's the ultimate cold case. The scene of the crime, the digging is there, but there are no fingerprints, no witnesses, obviously no motive apparent, and no weapon, well, presumably shovels and picks, but that doesn't help. You can poke and prod and measure and analyze the composition of the rock, but it won't tell you why someone decided to carve these particular holes that terminate so abruptly. It forces you into a realm of speculation, which, while fun for armchair historians like you right now, pondering this from the comfort of your potentially less damp surroundings, makes proper academic study incredibly difficult. Historians and archaeologists crave evidence. They want pottery shards, written records, architectural features, anything that provides a solid foothold for interpretation. These tunnels offer almost none of that. They are, in a sense, a vacuum of historical information. You look into the darkness expecting it to reveal secrets, and instead it just looks back silently, stubbornly, refusing to explain itself. The appeal lies in that very defiance of explanation. In a world where Google can answer almost any question in seconds, there's a quiet thrill in encountering something that remains resolutely offline, a historical fact that shrugs its shoulders and says, "Figure it out, or don't. Doesn't matter to me." It reminds you that the past isn't a neatly cataloged library. It's more like an ancient attic full of dusty boxes, some containing labeled treasures, others holding forgotten junk, and some just empty boxes that you swear you remember putting something important into. A mainstream historical fact that adds layers to this kind of puzzle is the fact that preservation in history is incredibly uneven. What survives from the past is often a matter of chance. The materials used, the location, political stability, deliberate destruction, or preservation, even just plain luck. A document gets eaten by mice, a wooden structure rots away, a stone building is repurposed or quarried for other uses. What we don't have often shapes our understanding as much as what we do. The lack of monastic records explaining these tunnels isn't necessarily suspicious. Medieval record-keeping, while sometimes extensive for administrative matters, might not have bothered detailing every digging project, especially if it was minor, unfinished, or considered mundane. Brother Giles started digging a hole behind the pig pen. It went nowhere. Note to self, tell Giles to stop digging holes. Not exactly the stuff that gets preserved for centuries. Consider the historical landscape around the monastery. Perhaps there were local events or circumstances now lost to the wider historical record that would have provided context. Was there a local tradition of subterranean activity? Was there a known geological feature nearby that might have inspired exploration? Was there a specific threat from a neighboring lord, or a disease that prompted thoughts of seeking refuge underground without documentation or corroborating archaeological finds from outside? The tunnels, these remain pure conjecture. You can imagine a historian poring over maps looking for clues, maybe finding a brief mention in a local chronicle about an unusually muddy winter or a rumor of a strange noise near the abbey grounds, and trying to connect it to the tunnels. It's often a process of grasping at faint signals in a sea of historical noise. A quirky or fringe tidbit sometimes floated around sites like this involves ley lines or alleged energy points. The idea, usually without scientific basis, is that certain locations hold mystical energy, and ancient peoples, or medieval monks in this case, were aware of this and built structures or dug tunnels along these invisible lines. Could the tunnels have been an attempt to tap into, or perhaps even contain, some perceived telluric energy beneath the monastery? It sounds far-fetched, and it is lacking any historical support or archaeological evidence within the tunnels like strange crystals or glowing moss, though that would certainly liven up the mystery. But the sheer irrationality of the tunnel structure makes people reach for less rational explanations. When the practical answers fail, the mind tends to wander towards the esoteric, perhaps hoping for a more satisfying, if less provable, narrative. You picture monks with dowsing rods, trance-like, pointing emphatically at a spot where the tunnels begin, convinced they found the monastery's spiritual meridian. Just kidding? Mostly, historians still argue whether the minimal effort evident in parts of the digging, if some sections appear less finished than others, suggests an early abandonment, or if the uniformity of the dead ends points to a deliberate design, however baffling. Was it a case of trial and error digging, where they started multiple tunnels, hoping one would break through to something useful or significant? Or was the plan always to have short dead-end tunnels? The latter seems particularly bizarre from a practical standpoint, reinforcing the idea that the purpose might have been non-practical, perhaps symbolic or spiritual. The enduring appeal also lies in the way it forces you to confront the limits of knowledge. We like to think that with enough research, enough data, we can unlock any secret of the past, but sometimes the past just holds on to its secrets. These tunnels are a physical manifestation of that historical opacity. They exist undeniable and real, yet their why remains elusive. It's like trying to remember why you went into a room only on a scale of centuries and involving a lot more digging. The reason was clear at the time, presumably, but the trail went cold long, long ago. Could it be that the tunnels had a purpose that was so specific to a particular event, a particular individual, or a particular short-lived circumstance, that once that moment passed, the tunnels became irrelevant and were simply forgotten? Maybe they were dug in preparation for one specific anticipated event, a siege that never came, the arrival of a particular relic that needed temporary secure storage, a planned escape that was called off. Once the event didn't happen or the need passed, the tunnels were abandoned, and their specific raison d'etre faded from collective memory, never making it into the monastery's official chronicles. This is plausible, but again, entirely speculative. You can almost hear the prior sighing in relief. Well, thank goodness we didn't need that elaborate tunnel system after all. Phew, let's just forget about it, shall we? The quiet persistence of this mystery is part of its charm. It doesn't demand your attention with dramatic battles or famous figures. It's humble, localized, a secret kept by the earth itself. It's the kind of mystery that makes you pause, scratch your head and think about the everyday lives of people centuries ago, trying to imagine what could possibly have driven them to undertake such a peculiar project. It humanizes history, reminding you that not everything fits neatly into grand narratives of kings and battles. Sometimes history is just about monks digging holes for reasons we might never fully grasp. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the value in these tunnels isn't in finally uncovering their original purpose, but in the questions they provoke. They are a physical prompt to consider the limits of historical knowledge, the role of chance in preservation, and the sheer, sometimes inexplicable things people did in the past. They stand as a silent monument to an unknown intention, a puzzle that invites endless contemplation precisely because it refuses to be solved. It's the historical equivalent of staring into the embers of a dying fire, seeing shapes and patterns that aren't really there, your mind trying to impose order on something inherently formless. Except here, the form exists, the tunnels, but the meaning doesn't. Consider the possibility, remote as it might seem, that the purpose was symbolic from the outset, but in a way we no longer understand. Cultures throughout history have imbued simple acts or structures with deep meaning that is impenetrable to outsiders or later generations. Was there a specific theological concept, a passage from Scripture, a piece of monastic lore that these tunnels were intended to represent in a physical form? A journey into darkness, a descent into the earth to meet death before resurrection, a physical representation of doubt or spiritual confusion. Without any accompanying text or symbolic carvings, this remains purely speculative, the kind of idea you might entertain late at night when the mystery feels particularly heavy. But given the monastic context and the lack of practical function, it's hard to entirely dismiss the possibility that the purpose was rooted in faith or symbolism, even if that purpose is now opaque to us. The quiet fame these tunnels have acquired among enthusiasts isn't because they lead to treasure or explain a major historical event. It's because they perfectly embody the captivating nature of the unsolved. They are a physical, I don't know from the past, a historical shrug emoji carved into the bedrock. And for those who find comfort and fascination in the quiet corners of history, in the puzzles that don't make the headlines, these tunnels offer a deep, albeit slightly frustrating well of contemplation. So as you picture yourself standing at the end of one of these dark passages, feeling the smooth, cool rock where it abruptly stops, remember that the silence you encounter isn't emptiness. It's the sound of history keeping a secret. It's the quiet hum of an enduring mystery that refuses to yield, inviting you to ponder the limits of knowledge and the vast, unknowable depths of the past. It's a sleepy mystery, perhaps, but a profound one in its own silent way. So you've journeyed with us, or rather you've pictured yourself standing there in the dim, cool light, filtering down a stone staircase descending into the earth beneath that ancient French monastery. You've walked the path short and strange leading to solid rock walls. You've felt the stillness, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and aged stone. You've entertained the possibilities from the mundane to the slightly absurd, and you've grappled with the central, undeniable fact these tunnels, for all their mystery and the human effort they represent, lead nowhere. They remain stubbornly silent about their purpose. It's the nature of some historical puzzles, isn't it? Not every question has a clean, satisfying answer waiting to be discovered. Some mysteries are built not on missing pieces that can be found, but on a fundamental lack of context, a silence that time has refused to break. These tunnels are a perfect example of that. They are a physical question mark carved into the landscape, a permanent monument to an unknown intention. And as the echoes of your imagined footsteps fade, and the quiet of the subterranean space settles back in, you're left with that lingering sense of wonder, mixed perhaps with a touch of historical frustration. You've considered the monks who dug them, the tools they used, the time they invested. You've imagined their lives structured by prayer labor and contemplation, and tried to fit this peculiar, seemingly pointless activity into that framework. Was it a collective effort ordered by the prior, or the pet project of one particularly eccentric brother with too much time on his hands and a fascination with geology? Was it a secret kept from the wider world, or something everyone at the monastery knew about but simply didn't think worth recording? The past in moments like these feels incredibly close, yet impossibly distant, separated by the simple fact that the people who held the answers are long gone, taking their motivations with them. The beauty of these less dramatic historical mysteries, the boring ones, as we sometimes call them, is that they invite a different kind of engagement. They don't overwhelm you with names and dates and battles. Instead, they invite you to pause, to look closely at a small, specific corner of the past, and to contemplate the quiet, everyday actions of people whose lives were so different from your own. They remind you that history isn't just made in palaces and on battlefields. It's also made in the dirt and the stone, in the silent, unexplained projects undertaken by ordinary, forgotten individuals. Think about the sheer scale of what we don't know about the past. For every famous figure or well-documented event, there are countless lives, countless small actions, countless projects, big and small, that have left little to no trace in the historical record. Most buildings from the past are gone. Most tools have rusted away. Most documents have been lost or destroyed. What survives is often accidental, a fragment here, a footnote there. These tunnels in their survival are unusual, but the lack of accompanying information about why they were dug is in fact quite common. Most historical puzzles aren't sensational secrets waiting to be uncovered. They are simply parts of the past that haven't been preserved in a way that allows for easy understanding. A mainstream historical fact that resonates here is the nature of medieval literacy and record-keeping. While monasteries were often centers of learning and did produce and preserve important texts, the types of records kept varied greatly. Administrative details, religious texts, chronicles of major events. These were often prioritized. Mundane activities, building projects, especially unfinished ones, or tasks perceived as simple labor, might not have been deemed important enough for formal documentation, particularly within the monastic routine, where manual labor was a form of prayer. So the absence of a document titled Account of the Secret Passage Project isn't necessarily a sign of extraordinary secrecy. It could just be a sign that it wasn't considered noteworthy enough to write down at the time. Brother Thomas dug a hole just doesn't have the same gravitas as Prior Benedict attended the Council of Toulouse. The quiet mystery of the tunnels allows for all sorts of speculation, and over the centuries, quirky or fringe tidbits might have attached themselves to the monastery's history. While there are no widely documented dramatic legends specifically about where these were tunnels, it's easy to imagine local folklore developing around an old abbey and its hidden spaces. Perhaps whispers of monks hiding from invaders, or stories of tunnels used for smuggling wine, or even tales of restless spirits associated with the dark underground. These stories, born from a lack of knowledge and a fertile imagination, become part of the informal, unverified history of a place. While entertaining, they usually offer little help in understanding the actual practical or impractical reasons behind the digging. You can almost hear a villager centuries ago muttering, "Aye, the old abbey has strange holes under it. They say the monks were trying to dig to the Holy Land." Pure fantasy, yes, but the kind of fantasy that unexplained features often inspire. Historians still argue whether the sheer lack of utility in the finished tunnels means they must have been abandoned very early in their construction, perhaps representing multiple failed attempts at something, or if their identical dead ends point towards a peculiar, possibly symbolic purpose that is simply opaque to modern understanding. Was it a spiritual exercise, a bizarre form of penance, or just incredibly poor planning repeated multiple times? The debate centers on whether to prioritize a practical, albeit failed explanation, or lean towards a non-practical, possibly religious interpretation for which there is no direct evidence. It's a classic case of interpreting silence. Are the tunnels silent because the project was insignificant and abandoned, or because its true meaning was intended to be understood only by a select few, or perhaps not even consciously articulated? The enduring appeal of this monastery and its perplexing tunnels lies precisely in this ambiguity. It doesn't offer answers, it offers questions. It doesn't provide closure, it provides contemplation. It's a reminder that the past is vast and complex, filled with human actions that don't always fit into our modern logic. It encourages humility in the face of the unknown and reminds us that sometimes the most fascinating history is the history that refuses to be fully known. It's the quiet persistence of a secret kept by stone and earth for centuries. As you finally let go of the image of the dark, cool passages and the questions they provoke, know that it's okay for a mystery to remain a mystery. Not everything needs a neat resolution, especially when dealing with the deep currents of time. The value often lies in the exploration itself, in the journey of wondering, imagining, and considering the many possibilities, even if the final destination is just a wall of rock. It's the quiet hum of history reminding you that there are still corners of the past waiting to be pondered, not necessarily solved. It's time now to let those thoughts drift away. The tunnels have played their part, leading you on a journey into the quiet, unsolved corners of history. Their secret, if they ever held one, beyond simple failed ambition, remains theirs. And that's perfectly all right.